Hi, good morning, everyone. So great to have you all here. I want to welcome and thank you all for being here, those of you here in person in Chicago and those who are joining in virtually. So the goal of my presentation today really is to make you aware of the theme that permeates throughout this two-day meeting, and also share some known published facts in the area of DEI research. So the theme of the meeting is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this theme is aligned very well with the NIA's goal in health disparities research, which is to understand the environmental, sociocultural, behavioral, and biological drivers of health inequities and disparities related to aging and diseases such as ADRD. As you all know, you noticed the agenda, that the DEI theme permeates through each and every session during this two-day meeting. And this is something new, the ADRC Executive Committee, and based on the input from the scientific community, we decided to have a theme for this meeting. So this is the first time, and hopefully it'll succeed and will produce some wonderful results. We should all be very proud collectively as the ADRC network and individual investigators, how far we have come in the past decade or two in the area of DEI research and disparities in ADRD, but perhaps there's some more way for us to go. So the goal of this meeting is to build upon the remarkable accomplishments that we have achieved in this area of research over the last couple of decades, and really, And really here at this meeting decide what for the future agenda for the meeting will be. We could identify new areas that need some work so that collectively across the ADRC network and beyond, we can address some of the special problems that ADRD disparities face. So why is DEI important for us? Well, there are multiple compelling reasons. You all are aware of most of them, but just to name some, DEI research will ensure that the studies are more representative of the US population and that the results are more generalizable, that it'll enhance the understanding of the ethno-racial differences across the full spectrum of ADRD research, which is its neurobiology, clinical presentations, diagnosis, treatment, prevention in different races. Also, it'll help us gain the trust and commitment of minoritized communities through community-based participatory research. And this in turn will help us recruit more people, retain them in the study, once again, so that the results are more generalizable. And it is clear that DEI research will help us reduce health disparities and discrimination that exists in healthcare even in this century. And all this will help us better manage conditions that predispose people to ADRD. In March of 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King made a statement on healthcare discrimination. He said that of all forms of discrimination and inequalities, injustice in health is most shocking and inhuman. Think about it. Dr. Martin made this statement over 55 years ago. It is unfortunate that even today, we have significant healthcare discrimination across most of the healthcare systems in the country. If we could tackle that, the returns will be phenomenal at multiple levels. And I think this is one of the goals collectively that we all have to accomplish. So when we talk about health disparities research, we all really have to understand the latest nomenclature and the definition of number of concepts and terms. And I just selected here two of them, race and ethnicity, because they are the most commonly used concepts in health disparities research. So just to be, we all understand, we're all on the same page. Race refers to the concept of dividing people into groups based on sets of physical characteristics. Race has no biological basis. It is the result of systemic and structural racism, and racial inequities, we all know, lead to substantial adverse socioeconomic and other consequences. The term racialization, it reflects categorizing or marginalizing a group of people. It again has no biological basis. So the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, has identified 5 racial categories, and you all know them. The ethnicity relates to shared cultural characteristics, and these include such as language, ancestry, religion, beliefs, etc. And the OMB identifies 2 categories in ethnicity, Hispanic or non-Hispanic, and these categories will apply to all races. So there'll be Hispanic or non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, so on and so forth. There is plenty of evidence, I think you all are well aware, that the ADRC prevalence and incidence, it varies with age, and also is a lot more common in certain groups, and those are African American, American Indians, and Native Alaskans. It is least common in Asian Americans, and that is one of the areas where there's a lot of research going on why Asian Americans are less prone to disease like ADRD. And also there is published evidence that AD and MCI, its prevalence is higher in blacks and non-Hispanic whites, in blacks and Hispanics, and it's about 2-fold higher than that seen in non-Hispanic whites. So the global population is ethnically and racially diverse. So this problem is not just confined to the United States, but globally. And that alone is a compelling reason for us to expand disparities research in ADRD. Also, we all know that the developing countries will face the largest number of people who will suffer from ADRD. And with limited resources, these countries are really going to suffer and struggle how to deal with disparities in ADRD. Also, there's limited information on the impact of race and ethnicity across the whole spectrum of ADRD research. It's neurobiology, presentation, treatment, diagnosis, prevention, etc. So there's some work that needs to be done. We know now that genetics plays a smaller role in explaining ethno-racial differences in ADRD prevalence. In fact, it is more social and environmental disparities that play a major role in the differences, in the prevalence differences we see in racialized groups. Think about it, the social and environmental disparities are modifiable and treatable. So there is a large group of causes that we could manage and modify, which in turn could reduce the prevalence and incidence of ADRD. Another compelling reason why disparities research in ADRD is critical. There's also lack of longitudinal studies that are exploring lifelong exposure. The word lifelong is important. We need to understand how the disease evolves over the life course. So these lifelong social, environmental, and behavioral exposures in various racialized groups, that would be so wonderful if we could do that. Also, we know that access to poor health, the poor quality of health, and discrimination in the healthcare systems, they are really major contributors to ADRD-related morbidity and mortality in marginalized populations. And also as providers, clinicians, scientists, we are well aware of the fact that the diagnosis of ADRD is significantly delayed in minoritized group. And the use of FDA-approved medications such as donepezil and memantine is much less in racialized groups compared to non-Hispanic whites. So in 2015, NI proposed this landmark foundational framework. And this framework really draws attention to the fact that health disparities research is the study of multiple factors, the environmental, behavioral, biological, sociocultural, that influence population-based level differences in people. So the study of these various factors which are now occurring with incentives from the NIA is going to really help us understand disparities. And also through this framework, the NIA is able to establish its own priorities, the portfolio of studies that are in this area of research, promote mechanistic research in disparities. Mechanistic research is critical in this area of research. And also really decide the future actions based on the present state of health disparities research. So this framework has played a critical role in enhancing health disparities research as it relates to ADRD. In the early part of this year, Dr. Carrie Gleason and Megan Zulstorf, two of the investigators and their team at Wisconsin ADRC, published this conceptual framework where they attempted to integrate the NIA disparities framework and the ATN framework. And really what this framework proposes or posits that various factors, the environmental, sociocultural, behavioral, they interact with the biological factors, including disease pathologies like neuroinflammation with the E4 genotype, so on and so forth. And these interactions activate certain mechanisms, molecular mechanisms, that eventually lead to the Alzheimer's pathology and resulting in the deposition of amyloid and tau and neurodegeneration. So there's a close connection between these multiple factors proposed by the NIA framework and the ATN, and I think this is interesting and important for us to focus on. So from the two frameworks, I think it is quite clear that the older racialized groups in the United States, they suffer from premature illnesses over their life course, very early on sometimes. And these illnesses, they activate certain environmental, biological interactions, which in turn activate mechanisms that cause ADRD. There's also possible that the sociocultural and environmental factors, they work more upstream than downstream, more upstream in the pathogenic pathways for ADRD. And these are modifiable factors. So if they do indeed act upstream and then activate molecular mechanisms to cause the disease, we have certain factors that we could modify and address. And I think that's an interesting change in the concept that they work upstream in the pathway leading to ADRD. Also, race and ethnicity, the differences in education, quality, behavior, sociocultural factors, it does affect cognitive resilience, which in turn will affect the prevalence of the disease. We know that African Americans, they have low performance in cognitive tests, and that is entirely because of testing bias and the fact that we don't have cognitive norms in various racialized groups. We cannot assume that the cognitive norms from non-Hispanic whites will apply to all the racial groups. So we need to find out establish those norms for racialized groups. And there's also Sid O'Brien and his group from Texas recently published that there are some distinct comorbid medical conditions that can affect the ADRD risk. They include inactivity, obesity, midlife hypertension, and so on. Again, these can be addressed and treated. Race and ethnicity are known to affect the biomarkers. Dr. Michelle Milkey in this session will make that presentation, but it is known that we don't have absolute cutoff points for various biomarkers, imaging and fluid biomarkers for racialized groups. Again, we cannot assume that the biomarker cut points in non-Hispanic whites will apply to all the other groups. And if we do, then we're going to overdiagnose the disease. So that's another area that needs to be addressed. It is well known that the CSF level of tau pathology, the total tau and the p-tau 181, is lower in African Americans. Why is it? Is it just because the cutoff points are not available, or is there something more than that? And I think that needs to be looked at. We also know that the plasma AD biomarkers, they are affected by ethnicities and comorbid medical conditions. My two more slides left here. In terms of clinical trials, it's a top priority for the NIA and all of us as a field. We know that as of today, less than 5% of clinical trial participants come from the underrepresented groups, just 5%. And you of course realize that limits the generalizability of the results. Also, many treatment trials, they report outcomes. They don't report outcomes by race and ethnicity. What they do, they co-vary the outcomes with race and ethnicity. Really what we need to do is to report the results for each ethnic group that is in the trial. Also, we don't know the attrition rates of URGs from the clinical trials. Thus, we don't know what the attrition bias is in these trials. And finally, an important point, something known as selection bias. What that means that most of the clinical trials, they recruit people from specialty clinics. That's a special group of people who come to our specialized clinics. What we need to do is population-based recruitment strategies into clinical trials. And once we do that, the results will be really generalizable to all the racial groups. So these are some of the limitations in clinical trials research. So about 2019, I believe, the Alzheimer's Station iStart group published some recommendations for health disparities research. And they said that we need to identify strategies to increase recruitment and retention of diverse populations into ADRC studies. They also, the point I made earlier, emphasized that we need to have lifelong exposure studies to understand how various factors affect the ADRD pathobiology. Also, we need to develop and validate cognitive norms for different racial groups and also cognitive cut points for imaging and fluid biomarkers. We need to utilize the NIA-funded, there are multiple NIA-funded longitudinal studies that have diverse populations. What we need to do is to go to those cohorts and conduct ADRD-related research because you have a life course information on those cohorts on multiple factors. We need to develop and validate models of risk and protective factors for racialized groups. And also, we need to employ the precision medicine approach to translate the findings into more improved healthcare. My final slide, I wanted to use this slide, I borrowed it from Dr. Carrie Gleason, as to think about how far we have come in the field of health disparities research, but what else we need to do to help NIA and NIH accomplish the goals that the 1993 NIH Revitalization Act established for us as scientists. As you all know, this act was approved by both the House and Senate with substantial bipartisan support. So the public and the government has expectations from us. We have come very far in health disparities research, but we got some ways to go, and here at the meeting, hopefully, we'll collectively brainstorm and think what else needs to be done in this area so that we can really remove disparities, if possible, from ADRD field and other field, and help NIH excel in this area and accomplish all the goals of the NIH Revitalization Act. So I'm going to end here. I may have maybe a couple of minutes. Do we have a couple of minutes, Hannah, here? Any questions, comments, anyone? Maybe a comment or two, anyone? Excuse me. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for the informative presentation. We recognize, and I'm speaking as a layman, history repeats itself. And so it becomes very important. We know the truths, and so it's good that we acknowledge what those truths are. As I look around this room, there are very few people of color. And one of the things we recognize that you have selection biases. And with the selection biases, all the different constraints that are out there actually exclude.
Yep.
And so what needs to be taken into consideration is that instead of having any type of categories, just take the population and go from that data. And I think you'll find more than what we're looking for in regards to Alzheimer's and the diseases that are out there. But I want to thank you so very, very much for what we are aware of in regards to disparities, and the call to action is hundreds of years overdue. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your comment.
Sanjay, I just want to make sure we recognize the contribution of the NINDS to this effort. As you know, they funded Diverse VCID, whose goal is to have equal representation of 3 major heritage groups. And so I think this is not just an NIA project. it is a NIH-wide project, and in dementia, it brings together both the NIA and the NINDS, and I feel very, very honored to be part of that and what Rod Corvo has emphasized. So I just wanted to bring that to the attention of the group and hope that we get more members joining.
No, thank you, Charlie. Yes, thanks for initiating and establishing that study. I think that's so critical for the field. We are a site, and many of you are sites for the study, so we'll make sure it succeeds. Thank you, Charlie. All right, I think we move with the agenda. So the next presentation is by Dr. Richard Hodes. Dr. Hodes directs the research program of the National Institute on Aging at the National Institutes of Health. A leading immunologist, Dr. Hodes was named director of the NIA in 1993 to oversee studies of biological, clinical, behavioral, and social aspects of aging. Under Dr. Hodes' stewardship, the NIA budget has grown substantially, reflecting increased public interest in aging as America and the world grows older. Dr. Hodes has devoted his tenure to the development of a strong, diverse, and balanced research program focusing on the genetics and biology of aging, basic and clinical studies aimed at reducing disease and disability, including Alzheimer's disease and age-related cognitive change, and also investigation of the behavioral and social aspects of aging. Ultimately, these effort and research advances into improved diagnosis and treatments for people with Alzheimer's and other dementias. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hodes to make his presentation. Dr. Hodes.
Good morning. I'm Richard Hodes, Director of the National Institute on Aging, and happy to be with you this morning. I apologize for the fact that it is recorded due to a schedule conflict, but I look forward to joining the meeting later this morning. I'd like to share with you a number of updates relevant to the program, and we'll be ready to have questions addressed should they come up during this talk by Eliezer and by Nina, who will be there live. And again, I'll be seeing you live later. I'd like to begin by giving you an update on congressional activities, including important appropriations activities. In June, the House Appropriations advanced out of committee a bill that included an increase in funding for NIH, for NIA, and with the inclusion of an additional $200 million targeted for ADRD research. In July, the Senate followed with a committee bill that also provided an increase for NIH, NIA, but with no targeting for Alzheimer's and related dementias research. As you all know, we are currently working under a continuing resolution because we have no federal budget. And so we work at a level that is flat to last fiscal year. This funding will take us through December 16th of this year, and will then await, we hope, final and definitive appropriations bill. Congressional language from the Senate, in particular, also included this statement, which directed NIA to provide Congress a report which details the number of individual Alzheimer's patients who gained access to clinical trials through the centers, as well as some additional information. Congress regularly asks for this type of information on federally funded programs. We are alerting you to their interest, and we expect to work with NAC to let you know what information is needed in response to this request. We can update the pay lines that are in effect, and I emphasize now in a continuing resolution, these are only interim pay lines, therefore extremely conservative. And this is a pattern we followed in prior years when we again began the fiscal year under a continuing resolution. The pay lines you can see here are the percentiles CSR reviewed. For the general pay line that is not targeting to AD/ADRD, an 8th percentile for the less than 500,000 direct costs, with our usual advantage given to new and early stage investigators. And to the right, you can see for the AD/ADRD pay lines, again, 20th percentile, and then 23rd and 25th respectively for NI and ESIs, with a still higher bar for the over 500,000 direct costs. And again, I stress, this is all interim. We expect to see these change as the year goes forward, and in particular, when we have a final appropriation. This slide illustrates similarly the general and AD/ADRD pay lines for those that are reviewed by NIA and therefore receive priority scores and not percentile. All preliminary, and we have a hope and real expectation that these will change as the months go by, and in particular, again, when we have an appropriation for this fiscal year. And turn now to talk to the bypass budget. This illustrates the original congressional language that established a requirement for us each year through 2025, specifically for the director of NIH to submit to Congress a statement of the funds necessary to pursue the goals of the national plan at optimal efficiency. This has been done each year, and most recently, the professional judgment budget for fiscal 2024 was communicated in July of this year, 2022. And you can see here, it indicated the amounts of additional funding in each of the research categories illustrated, which totaled an increase of $498,000 over the presumed base, which was flat to this past year. We anticipate receiving an estimated $177 million that becomes available for funding because of the completion of prior projects, which led to an increase request of $321 million. That would be $320 million over the current FY22 estimated funding for ADRD of $3.55 million, or a total request therefore, which would be $3.87 million. This year, we have stressed in the narrative for the bypass budget a prospective view, which, consistent with the fact that this is a budget describing resources needed for future investments, identifies by research areas, the areas in which opportunities exist and to which funds would be applied. This is in contrast to a report on recent accomplishments, equally important, but which will be reported in a separate document, the AD/ADRD Progress Report. We expect this to be released in the fall of this year. Thus, we're emphasizing both research advances, but a forward-looking prospective narrative that accompanies the bypass budget describing opportunities for which investments would be applied. I want to stress our continued emphasis across NIH and NIA, and I know across the nation, on health equity. The UNITE program at NIH is a focal point of this. The U for understanding stakeholder experience by listening. The N, importantly, now new research on health disparities, minority health, and health equities, and this is extremely relevant to the work of the centers. I for improving the culture in the workforce at NIH. T for transparency and communicating and our accountability, and E for our working in the extramural research ecosystem to also establish diversity and equity in that workforce. In terms of research support NIH-wide, a strategy for DEIA, that is diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, will be released this year in the fall and will be reflective of the NIH-wide activities in this domain. Would note that NIA has a number of resources that are particularly focused on recruitment and diversity for participants in clinical studies and clinical trials. These include a national strategy for recruitment and participation, ADOR, or the Alzheimer's and Dementia Outreach Recruitment and Engagement resource, which is a set of databases that can be used by those who are developing their own programs. Outreach Pro, a tool that enables healthcare professionals to more easily use the data, formats, graphics that we put together to tailor their own strategies and messages. And finally, a clinical studies recruitment planning guide outlining strategies for, in particular now, community-based focus for research participation. In addition to a number of NIH-wide programs, NIA has a number of specific programs aiming at diversity in early career researchers. For PhD students, the R36, which supports research dissertation awards to increase diversity. For early stage investigators, the Butler-Williams Scholars Program held each summer, and GEMSTAR and the K76 Beeson programs, both RFAs, to which invitations are made to the research community on an annual basis. And for AD/ADRD targeted in particular, a diversity and translational research and small research grants for next generation of clinical research and AD programs with the PARs, PASs illustrated here, and we hope to be participating in these as a part of the function and activities of the centers. Some updates at both NIA and NIH. First, an important one, an NIH-wide policy on data management and sharing. There has been issued a new NIH policy for data management and sharing that will come into effect January of this year. It will require all funded researchers to prospectively submit a plan outlining how scientific data from the research will be managed and shared. Links here, but we anticipate this will be a topic of active engagement and discussion between all of you and program staff as we move forward with this implementation in January of the upcoming year. In our series of summits, next up in rotation is the 2023 Dementia Care and Caregiving Research Summit. Decision has been made to hold this March 20 to 22 virtually, and I encourage all of you to register for participation. Each year, we, as a result of consultation through the summits and discussions and meetings, such as the ones we're engaged in right now, arrive at a series of objectives, priorities for research in years to come. These are developed and presented to our National Advisory Council as concepts, clearance from which is required before we issue targeted set-asides of funding in particular areas. So I share with you here those ADRD concepts which were cleared by Council in September. There are 8 of them listed here. I won't read through them each, but they cover a diversity of programs with a link here. These generally are translated into research announcements, but this is dependent upon funding, having a budget and appropriation, having the actual mechanisms approved. But I urge all of you to begin thinking at the stage of this concept clearance. These are likely to become the next generation of solicitations, and preparation for them can begin now, again, with an invitation to discuss all of this in consultation with our program staff. I will point to a couple of examples of these concepts that have been approved. The ADRD Real World Data Platform is an ambitious one, which aims to harness a variety of sources of public-private data for longitudinal integration and coordination, leveraging new technologies as well of artificial intelligence and machine learning. You can see, as illustrated in this platform here on the left, we'll bring together data from such sources as pharmacy chains, health organizations, health records, claims, social determinants of health, and wearable sensors, all to feed into what we anticipate and target as an 80% coverage of the country's entire ADRD population, which will then serve for registries, for research studies, and for clinical research networks through, as you can see on the site, screening, recruitment into studies, drug repurposing based on real-world observational data, long-term follow-up, surveillance, and innovative trials. We invite comments on this during the current period of open opportunity in RFI. It's innovative, it's bold, I think it has huge potential. It's going to be a substantial undertaking for all of us, and we look forward to it, clearly with implications well beyond AD and ADR research as this is successfully implemented. Another area is that of the microphysiologic systems to advance precision medicine. The use of in vitro systems, cell-level organ and tissue culture, now highly sophisticated, enlightened by the ability to use such input as molecular multi-omics to quality control, if you will, to screen that these microphysiologic systems are, to the best of our ability, replicative of the in vivo behavior of the brain, the human brain, in health and disease. So a new set of initiatives out soliciting research in that area. We had language in the FY22 appropriation encouraging exposome-related research around Alzheimer's disease. And so this concept in particular is now the source of a number of initiatives illustrated here. And I would stress the breadth of these, from the impact of toxicants in the environment through social determinants of health and gene-environment interactions. Another set of anticipated solicitations and targeted set-asides. And finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Amy Kelly, who has recently joined NIA as its deputy director. She joined us in September, just last month. She'll play a critical role in all of the strategic activities of the Institute. She joined us from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where she was professor, vice chair for health policy and faculty development, the Herman Merkin Professor in Palliative Care in the Brookdale Department of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine, and Senior Associate Dean for gender equity in research affairs. She brings all of these talents to us. She is going to be with us live and virtual, so she'll say hello to you in a moment as soon as I have a chance to say goodbye. And again, I'll join you all later this morning. And finally, want to again urge you to stay informed and connect with some of the things we've talked about. Links shown here to be familiar with funding opportunities and approved concepts, and a blog if you'd like to be receiving proactive, regular information on all of our activity. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I look forward to returning to participate in the session with you, live and virtual, and to discussing the exciting events, past, present, and future in our interactions with the Center's program. Thank you all, and good morning.
Thank you, Dr. Hodis. Our next presentation is Dr. Eliezer Maslia. Just to let you know that there'll be Q&A session after all the NI leaders have made their presentation, so you'll get a chance to ask some questions. So Dr. Maslia joined the National Institute on Aging, Director of the Division of Neurosciences in summer of 2016. Before joining NIA, he held joint appointments as tenured track professor in the departments of neurosciences and pathology, and as director of the autopsy service at UCSD Medical Center. He's obviously a prolific researcher and has published over 900 original research papers and has a number of patents to his name. So it's a pleasure to invite Dr. Maslia to make his presentation. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and great to be here live again. Really fantastic. It's a great feeling, and thank you for all of you to join us. So I'll give you a few more updates as to the efforts that we've been doing in terms of executing the mission of diversity at NIA, and how could that be of help to your research and getting a better integration with the mission of the Alzheimer's Centers. So as you know, our focus has been these years to integrate research in aging, genetics, and environment to have a much better view of the mechanisms of neurodegeneration, proteinopathy, and how can we use all this information for developing new diagnostics and therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And of course, this has been an incredibly exciting moment. I think this is a historical moment. Now, with all the tremendous effort that has been done toward advancing the national plan to address Alzheimer's, all the exciting new findings in the genetics field and molecular pathogenesis field, with all these new immune, endosome, synaptic, and metabolic pathways involved in neurodegeneration, all the very exciting new biomarkers that you guys have discovered, and now all that data being shared very widely thanks to all the funding that we're receiving. We have now approximately 400 clinical trials going on. We have plasma biomarkers. Of course, we got the COVID challenge, but I think everybody has raced to that challenge, and we're doubling down in our efforts. And now there has been some really exciting news in the field with one of the first phase 3 clinical trials with lecanemab showing some positive signal, which we're going to learn more about in a couple of weeks. So I think we're in a great shape toward 2025, and now with this expansion and thinking about research on diverse populations, I think it couldn't be coming in a better moment, and I'm really pretty excited to see the level of commitment of the whole community on making this happening, and that together with all the other things that have been going on, I think that's a perfect situation to really expand and move forward toward the goals of 2025. At the Division of Neuroscience, research on diversity has always been quite critical. And as you can see, the number of awards that we're funding has been increasing steadily throughout the years. We have almost 600 now projects in this regard. I also should mention that the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, with whom we very closely collaborate, and other divisions within NIA play a very important role here. And as a matter of fact, we have some representatives from Behavioral and Social Research here. Dr. Elena is here, and Nina will introduce the rest of the team later on. This research on diverse populations is primarily in the area of population studies and genetics, but of course also on clinical interventions, behavioral systems, and lesser so in mechanisms and translational research. But we're hoping that that would increase throughout the years. Now, many of our very large programs are part of this diversity effort, both as part of the national plan, but also as a part of the plan that Dr. Hout has mentioned to you, the National Strategy for Recruitment and Participation. Many of you play a critical role in that program, and we thank you tremendously for that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the programs that we're now funding going in the direction of increasing diversity, like ADNI 4, the HAV HD study in Texas. But we also have other studies that have been doing this for some time, and you can see in parentheses which diverse populations are included. I'll talk a little bit about Step Up. And this DPPOS is an interesting example. It's a diabetes program that I'll mention as well. But we also have other programs like Strong Heart that includes American Native populations, ADSP, that we're going to hear a lot about the tremendous efforts that have been doing there, and the Health and Retirement Study that the Division of Behavioral and Social Research manages, that is also expanding tremendously and doing a great effort in terms of diversity. ADNI 4, well, I don't need to really explain ADNI 4 here, or ADNI in general, but this iteration of ADNI is really a tremendous expansion into what ADNI has been doing in prior years, really going in the direction of diversity, and all 59 sites, and as we all know, they do a very detailed clinical, cognitive, imaging, etc. protocol, and the purpose is to have 500 rollover participants from ADNI 3 and 500 new participants, of which 60% would be diversity, and about 40% MCI, 40% controls, and 20% dementia. And their strategy, which is quite an interesting strategy, is that they are actually going to start with digital marketing and other different tools to capture 20,000 individuals, of which through Quest Lab and plasma testing, 4,000 will be selected, and out of those 4,000, the 500 will come, plus the other 500 that will come from the rollover of ADNI 3. They created new engagement cores with Dr. Rivera Mint and Congo as PIs. I already mentioned enroll 50 to 60% diversity, community engagement, at least 15 hubs site with full recruiters. So really a massive effort to increase diversity in ADNI. And I mean, we've seen some of the really very exciting results in ADNI recently, in terms of plasma biomarkers, synaptic biomarkers, but again, with the caveat that, and I think Sanjay really talked very well about how do we interpret all these novel biomarkers in diverse population. And the study of Sid O'Brien in Texas, the Health Aging Brain Study, I think it's a great example. We funded in prior years through R56s and R1 said to develop this cohort of Mexican American, African Americans in Texas, really with great success. You can see in the tables the number of individuals that have been able to recruit, I mean, over 1,500, and also all the individuals in which amyloid PET and tau PET have been made, and how he's able to find differences both in ApoE as well as in the ATN biomarkers in different populations with, for example, Mexican Americans having pretty high levels on these biomarkers similar to Hispanic whites, while in African Americans is a different story. So we're really looking forward further these studies. I think ATN biomarkers definitely have different prevalence among different populations and could be related to different outcomes, and taking into consideration clinic, demographic, and sociocultural factors are as well important. And for this reason, this year now, Sid and his colleague have been funded to go ahead with a full-fledged study of these populations, and now they are going to go up to 1,500 Mexican American, 1,500 African Americans, and 1,500 non-Hispanic whites. So almost, 4,500 individuals, really pretty impressive study with the 24-month follow-up intervals, community-based. They have a great relationship with the community, a great engagement with the community, and they have projects that will be looking at the effects of diversity on NTN framework, BMI and NTN, and expose some, and really looking at a number of features that you're all familiar. One program that might be less familiar to you is this DPPOS program, that is the Diabetes Prevention Program Outcome Study. And this is a program that has been managed by NIDDK in collaboration with NCI, with NIA, and other institutes for many years. And this program initially was looking at outcomes of metformin treatment of pre-diabetic and diabetic individuals for a long period of time. And the amazing thing about this program is the diversity of the population on of the program. And now the individuals on that program have become older, and basically we took over that program to study clinical outcomes, biomarkers, and so on in all the individuals with pre-diabetic or diabetes type 2, and doing all kinds of biomarkers. They have an excellent retention in that program, and they already have done, even now, some very important contributions in understanding the role of ApoE4, sex differences in different diverse populations, and so on. So that's going to be also a very exciting program to follow. And then, of course, we're going to hear a lot about ADSP today. So that is another program that has been done a tremendous effort in expanding diversity. The expectation is to have over 100,000 whole genomes, and they already have done tremendous progress identifying over 75 risk loci. 20 of these genes have been confirmed. And as you all know, also in the last few years, we've been supporting a consortium in machine learning, phenotype harmonization, and functional genomic. And really now the big push is in terms of diverse populations. Both we are funding now a new infrastructure program in Africa, and you will hear more about that from Dr. Pericat Bands. We're also hoping to do the same thing in Asia, and Lisan is going to tell you more about it. And we're really funding now different grants to study populations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, like a lot of the work that Richard May you have done. And again, as I said, I'm really not going to go into that. You're going to hear a lot more from the next speakers. But this is where the distribution of population on ADSP is now, and that's where we wanted to raise that number. I mean, given that we know how genes like CA7, SORLA1, ApoE vary among different populations. So the idea is to better understand the genetic diversity as it relates to ancestral populations with over 18,000 cases and over 18,000 control from different populations, and really going throughout the world. And I'm really not going to go more into that. I'm running out of time, and there are going to be speakers talking about this. So I'll move on, and I say that registries also play a very important role in trying to advance all these efforts. I already mentioned, and Richard mentioned also this national strategy. And the Step Up program, Jessica at Banner, have been doing really a tremendous effort on trying to understand all the psychosocial, environmental, and so on effort that change the attitudes of people in terms of participating in these registries, and how can we improve in that regard, especially as it relates to diverse populations. They also got a supplement for studying the impact of COVID precisely on a willingness of participants to go into all these registries. And I mean, at the end, that's going to have a tremendous impact in all the work that we're doing. And they just recently published some very interesting results on individuals from diverse populations and how they vary in their responses. For example, white women were more likely than white men to take memory and thinking tests, and white women more likely than Hispanic men to provide family member contact. So really very valuable information about how to continue running in the future many of these registries that, as we've been talking about, are going to be critical for all the diverse work. So at the end, all these data will need to be harmonized. As I said, we have a data harmonization efforts going on, and it needs to be shared. And as we know, all these very rich genetics data from diverse cohorts will be distributed through NIGAT. A lot of course, the work that you guys are doing, but also studies like the DPPOS and other diverse population studies will be shared through NAC. And we already have been sharing data from diverse populations through AMP-AD. Today I don't have time to talk about that, but the other studies that I mentioned, ADNI4, HHABS, and of course ACTC and others, Trulawney, with the objective of getting to the personalized medicine effort. But definitely having that information ready and available to all of you, to all the centers, and making sure, and as Sanjay said, that all the centers are aware of all these very rich new data that it's been generating, and having better coordination, and having you the opportunity to use all that data, I think is quite critical. So I'll thank you for your attention, and we'll be available for questions after Nina's presentation. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Great to see you all and be here in person. Thanks for those who are here, and appreciate all those online. Feels weird to be here in person, but really happy to see everybody. I wanted to, actually, Hannah, I don't think this has my new slide. Okay. So actually, I just wanted to start out with a comment about the DEI theme. I want to really thank Sanjay for pushing forward with that, and the executive committee, which is Suzanne Kraft and Oscar Lopez, and the NAC team. This is a new thing we're trying at the centers, to have a theme for the meeting, and I think even before we get going, just putting it together has been a real success, and appreciate everyone's interest and motivation to work to make it happen. So I want to thank everyone who has worked on putting these agendas together for the full meeting and for incorporating this theme. It has been, as I think you all know, an important area for me and for Cerise and Grayson working on the centers. It's something we've been working very hard to try to improve, and it matters, and it mattered before 2020. And so I'm really excited to hear all about what's going on. We have a number of centers who have been doing an excellent job in this area and contributed substantially to the national strategy for recruitment and retention and to the companion recruitment guide. A number of people in this room and in our centers really put a lot of thought into those, so I hope that if you haven't had a chance to take a look at them, you will. I also wanted to begin with reminding everyone, I know you all know this, but we see the Alzheimer's centers as playing a major role, not just locally and nationally, but really internationally in the development of new approaches, critically not just in Alzheimer's. I know we're called Alzheimer's centers, but I think because we have been so open for many, many years to including the related dementias, and I can't wait for that nomenclature work to finish because I really don't like the related dementias term. But I think, because we have centers that are focused on non-Alzheimer's dementias and understanding how to distinguish and understanding how these multiple different misfolded proteins appear in individuals, I think we've had a head start on this as a program for a long time, and I am just really happy to help guide what we're doing in that field with the broad view. And so I just kind of want to congratulate you on where we are with that now and encourage everyone to continue. These are major areas. I'm not going to read through that whole list I have on the screen now, but I hope that you all are proud of all of these activities that we bring together as a centers program. As Eliezer mentioned, we have a number of NIA staff here in the room. And so I'm just going to ask everyone on here to stand or raise your hand so folks can identify you if they want to talk to you. But Eliezer, Jenny Larkin, I think most of you have not met in person. She's back there waving her hand. She is our deputy director of our division, and she has a lot of areas of expertise, has been at NIH for many, many years, in other institutes as well, but a major focus on data management and sharing. So if you have some questions about that, she's a good person to talk to, and we're happy to have her here. And the three of us. And Elena Fazio is here. She is from the Division of Behavior and Social Research and is I don't know the official title, but the sort of Alzheimer's representative from that division, and she's in charge of the CARE Summit as well. So she knows a huge amount, and I've had the pleasure of working with her on a number of projects, so I hope you'll say hello to Dr. Fazio. And we have Courtney Wallen, who I didn't see, so I don't know where she is. She's there, from the Office of Legislation, Policy, and International Activities. So if you have any questions about Congress or our budget or any of those other areas, policy, she's a great person to talk to and can explain how that all works. And last on here, Katie Murray, I didn't see her either. She's there from our communications office. And at the end of my slides, I have some information from our communications office. But I'll take this moment to remind you all that we really do want to hear in advance if you have something really exciting coming out before it's out. We love to know about that so we can share it with the world. So Katie is a good person for you to talk to. We are really excited to have Sasha Dakic. She's going to be joining us next week, actually. So it'll be a team of 4 at NIA, me, Cerise, Grayson, and Sasha. And she's had a lot of experience in basic science and medical research generally. She has a PhD in molecular biology, and she was conducting stem cell differentiation research at NIH before she'll be coming to us. And we're really excited to have more help, because as you can see, this is a very large program, and with just 3 of us, we're quite busy, as you all know if you've tried to email us. Okay, so Dr. Hodis mentioned this in his presentation. There are approved concepts from our council. Many of you have been on our council, so you know how this works. The concepts get approved. They may or may not turn into FOAs, but I did send the link around a bit ago when it came out. This also usually appears in the blog from our deputy director on the NIA website. But the first one listed, as many of you may have noticed, was the ADRCs for the renewal. And I urge you to take a look at some of the language in there. That's all we can say about what will be coming in the FOA. I know a number of you want to know when it will be out, and we actually don't even know. And if we did, we wouldn't be able to tell you. This happens all the time, and as many of you also know, sometimes things change after we submit it to our system. It gets lots of levels of review, and things can change, as what happened with the rec being inserted. I know it came as a shock to many of you. So we don't always know those things are going to happen, and so that's why we are not able to say when. Sorry. And I wanted to also share, we have a number of new ADRC directors. So some folks have stepped down or stepped away from the centers. So we have now Ann McKee, congratulations, is now the PI for the Boston University ADRC, and I did see her, Ann, somewhere. I don't see her. Justin Miller is leading the exploratory ADRC in Las Vegas. I didn't see Justin here. There he is. And Gil Rabinovich, I know, is not here, but he's taken over at UCSF, so congratulations to him. And we did have some emails about this. Julie Schneider is now leading at Rush. Hi, David. Is Julie here? I don't see her. There's very bright lights up here, so sorry if Julie's here. Everyone knows Julie. And Glenn Smith is interim at Florida. Todd Goldie has moved to Emory. And so Glenn is holding down the fort there. And we want to thank Neil Cowell, Marwan Sabah, Bruce Miller, and David Bennett and Todd Goldie for their contributions to the center's program and their leadership. So NAC, as many of you have definitely noticed, has taken on a huge amount in recent years, and particularly this past year, really ramping up in so many different areas. Special thanks to Sarah Biber and Hannah Rosentretter, because they've just really, really stepped up. So much going on there. I know the data folks know from the work groups that you've been on with NAC. And NAC is also ramping up a lot on communication, trying to really get information out within our community and out of our community. And so you'll be seeing a lot more in the NAC session about all of the different major activities they've been working on. This is the sort of overarching vision. As NAC is on a mission to modernize data collection, integration, and sharing to advance Alzheimer's and related dementias research. Working on this data front door idea and collaborating with NICRAD, SCAN, and all of the genetics folks to really get this information much easier for within our community, again, and outside of our community to help make the data more findable, accessible, and really get more people using it and hopefully make more scientific advances to help us get rid of these diseases. Importantly, I see Greg Jica sitting right here. I want to thank you for all of your work on the UDS4 and the whole team. We've really had an extensive amount of time. The clinical task force has been working extremely hard on the UDS4, meeting very frequently. I just want to really appreciate those teams. They've done so much, and it's coming. We're getting there. It's going to be a big change, and the uniform data set, as you all also know, I think, is not really just for this Alzheimer's Centers community. It gets used by many other studies and also internationally. And so there's work and planning going on to translate to Spanish and Chinese for us to use, and these are going to be done in a very systematic and careful way. And the updates, I think, are really going to help our field broadly. I have a few slides here now on the committees, the steering committees for the centers that are meeting here. Activities from the Data Core Steering Committee. They've really been engaging with a lot of cross-disciplinary collaborations. We assured that members from the Data Core are attending the CTF work groups and working with NAC members at the steering committee as well. And then the EDC, the Electronic Data Capture Working Group, has been a wonderful collaboration with NAC. There's 75 members from across 28 ADRCs working on this, and it's really going to help when we have the UDS4, all of the data submission and defining requirements and developing forms and working on training and education to make this really great. So the ORCOR also has, if you missed these, I strongly urge you to take a look. We had Gina Green-Harris present 2 webinars because the first one was so well received. There's a second one put together by the ORCOR Steering Committee, and these are available on the NAC website. They've also initiated some discussions to explore faith-based models for recruitment, and we have Pastor Jenkins here, and he has participated in some of these discussions. Thank you, Pastor Jenkins. They've been strategizing new ways to increase peer support and collaborations across ORCOR. So this is becoming more and more important that we have sharing across centers on strategies and other ways of engaging our local communities. They've organized a special meeting with ORCOR leads, and we hope that that can maybe serve as a model for other cores as well. It's really important to have these cross-core collaborations. And they have kept diversity both demographically and professionally at the center of all of their efforts. And the Neuropath Core, there is a digital pathology working group that was created several years ago. They've done multiple surveys, and digital pathology is becoming more and more important. And at the Neuropathology Core meeting, Brittany Duggar will be talking about that survey and how it's hopefully going to impact what we do at the centers. There's also an effort afoot with NINDS on common data elements. And so it's not going to come up at this Neuropath Core Steering Committee, just this is a heads up that that is being worked on, and many of our Alzheimer's Centers Neuropath folks are involved with that effort. They've also been collaborating with the REC Steering Committee. I will take credit for this idea. I used to work at the Arizona Alzheimer's Center, as many of you know, and they used to have tours of the brain bank, and I thought that was terrific. The community thought it was terrific. And my favorite part was to attend the clinical path conferences. And I have thought for a long time that it would be great if we could open those up more and allow our trainees and other folks from outside the center's program, if possible, to be able to understand how these ClinPath conferences work. And so there's been discussion. Liz Head has taken the lead on this from the Rec Steering Committee to work with the clinical core and the neuropath core and figure out how we can do that. So I'm really excited about that. There are a lot of privacy issues and other concerns, but we're going to do our best to make that happen. And then the last, for the neuropath core, the Clarity study that I'm pretty sure everyone's aware of, they've been working on ways to help collect tissue from deceased participants for that. Dirk Keene is going to give an update on the Neurobiobank pilot project. Just as a reminder, there have been 3 sites working with Neurobiobank from the ADRCs to try to figure out how best to leverage that as a resource, again, to try to get more tissue availability and more autopsy data and information for the research community, and encourage particular underrepresented groups, particularly underrepresented in brain donation, to have more willingness to donate for autopsy. So I also really want to encourage, I hope everyone's planning to stay. We have these 2 sessions, and again, this and the theme and the cross-core collaborations, these are all based on feedback that NAC and we have gotten from previous meetings. So we're really excited to have these 2 great sessions at the end of the day tomorrow, one led by Amy Kind on translational research, with some terrific speakers, but it's intended to be largely discussion. So we're going to be talking about how we can engage the centers cross cores to help really make a difference in the world, not just do our research. And then the other session I'm also really excited about. I don't know, I can't be in 2 places at once, but Crystal Glover and Julie Schneider are going to lead a session about diversification of brain tissue and see what we can do as a community to improve our diversity of folks donating their brains. So this is just a quick update from the RCCN. If you recall, that is a NIA-funded group across all of the NIA center programs. So the ADRCs are just one of those. And they are working to help with some of the training. They have workshops, they have grants, travel awards, pilots. They just closed an FOA, so check out that website and keep your eye on it. We also wanted to throw this in here. We've had some questions about SCAN and compliance. So this is in your notice of award language. It does say that amyloid PET, tau PET, and MRI that are collected, that are supported by your center award, do have to follow the SCAN protocol. So in case that wasn't clear for anyone or you missed that, we just wanted to draw attention to it. The REC is really, the steering committee has been extremely active, really exciting work they're doing. This one is, they're planning a roundtable on December 9th at noon Central Time between NIA and the Alzheimer's Association. They've been working with them pretty heavily to talk about early career funding opportunities. So hopefully folks can get registered for that. We have the agreed work group, which I think was very timely, that we put together a number of years ago now, talking about disclosure, and this is going to become more and more important. And I love the fact that the Alzheimer's centers, as well as others, it's an open group, anyone can join at any time. They have 6 subgroups, as you can see there in the purple, and they meet regularly to talk about ongoing work, thinking about new biomarkers, who do we tell what to, when, and how do they decide whether they want to know, and questions like that. So there's really a lot of activity going on, a lot of publications, webinars, other communication tools, decision tools. So I encourage you to check out that website. It's agreeddementia.org. We also had this participant first group that we put together. I worked with folks at the Alzheimer's Association and Emily Largent to lead this group on what to do when clinical trials end early. And that is complete now with a publication. It was intended for clinical trial sites. There was pharma folks involved. And I think it's really fantastic, these recommendations, and I hope it makes a difference for people participating in clinical trials. Other thing we want to make sure everyone's aware of, this AlzNet, the Alzheimer's Network. It's being led by the Alzheimer's Association, and Maria is here in the room, and Gil and Mike Raffi. They are working on transforming our ability to look at real-world data and real-world evidence for tracking FDA-approved drugs in the real world. So it's intended to be a treatment-agnostic network to follow patients in real-world clinical settings. And this has been actively being planned for quite some time as well. And if you have any questions about it, you can ask Dr. Carrillo. Okay, 3 more quick slides here. I just wanted to make sure to raise some awareness about our new publications from NIA that are available, of course, free to the public, to you all to use. We have Reducing Your Risk of Dementia, Tips for Managing Agitation, Aggression, and Sundowning, What Do We Know About Healthy Aging, and Biomarkers and How They Help Diagnose Dementia. Again, if you have any questions about availability of materials, you can email the NIA press team there at the link. The ADRCs, we actually have a Twitter feed that follows the ADRCs that have Twitter accounts, so you can check that out. And again, as I mentioned, if you have any new findings coming out, please do let us know. Some of you are great about that, and some of you, it's been a bit of an afterthought, and we're just really excited to promote what the Alzheimer's centers are doing and trying. I feel quite strongly about this as a publicly funded group, that we should really be able to let the public know what we're doing and what it means for the field and for people with the disease and their families. So I think that was my last slide. And Dr. Baker, did you want to?
And just a quick heads up while we take questions. If you want to ask a question of the NIA folks, please line up at the mic. We are cutting this Q&A to 5 minutes as we're a little over time.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick. Nina, thank you. I just wanted to draw our attention to a couple of community members that we have in attendance, which I think is a great model going forward to make sure we have their voice at the table. Pastor Jenkins, would you mind standing up for just a minute? This is Reverend, thank you. Reverend Pastor Jenkins, Reverend Howard Jenkins, I call him Pastor, from the Rhode Island area, is a true leader in this community, in that community, in the faith community in particular. And I've had the honor to work with him in a large multi-site trial, and he has been inspirational to me in our work on helping us open our eyes to something we may have missed in the past. And he'll be talking more about that tomorrow in our ORCOR session. And then Gina Green-Harris, where are you? Would you stand up, please? Thank you. Gina is the one that Nina referenced a little bit ago about providing the Participant Advisory Board webinars. I've also had the honor of working with her. She is a strong voice to get us to think about changing the power, shifting the power a little bit to include the community in making decisions about what research needs to go forward. So Gina, thank you for being here.
any questions for Eliezer? No? Okay, good. You can ask us later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can, yeah, if you need to talk about pay lines or anything.
Well, thanks to all our NI leaders for making an outstanding presentation. Thank you. All right, so we will move to the next presentation, Dr. Walter Kuker. Dr. Kuker is Director of NEC, and he's also Professor of Epidemiology at University of Washington, the other UW. So welcome, Bud, please. Thank you. You all know him well. Thank you.
Well, hi, everybody. It's really good to see you all. You know, it's been so long since we've all gotten together actually in person and kind of not on Zoom and the little postage stamp sized pictures and so on. So I'm really pleased to be here. I hope you're all excited about that. I'm going to give you a little bit of a NAC update today, but there's going to be much more this afternoon in the NAC session, as I'll point out. Make sure I can operate this machinery here. Let's see, are these things up? This is just a snapshot of what we have available right now. There's about 46,000 people in the database, followed for different lengths of time. About 16,000 of those are active, and this covers about 172,000 visits that you all have done in your clinics. That's really pretty big accomplishment for all the ADRCs to be working on this stuff all the time. 7,000 neuropathology examinations from the people in the UDS. So this doesn't count also the others that we have accumulated from before the UDS started. So there's really probably another 10,000 that are available in some form or another for those earlier cases. To date, there's about 1,100 published studies using NAC data. That's really quite a lot too. So thank you all for doing all this. Right now we've got 37 active ADRCs, counting the exploratory ADRCs, or provisional, I guess, ADRCs. So as you know, we've been working really closely with the clinical task force. The clinical task force has been working really hard in looking in detail at each one of the forms and how to best maybe modify it, make it more usable, more up-to-date, less burdensome, just doing literally everything with this. And so we've been working really closely and also adding some possible new kinds of things to the overall UDS or to the effort. Social determinants, also a COVID questionnaire that I'll mention in a few minutes, getting some more information in on digital things and so on. So lots of different stuff going on there. Here's a little bit more of a summary, as you can see on the left-hand side. A number of the forms have either had no changes or have been already approved by the clinical task force. And you'll notice here also the B3 form, the UPDRS has been brought back for a second appearance from UDS2. This is the Stanley Fawn version of the UPDRS, and so that's coming back. There's still a number of forms that are under review or significant modification, as you can see in the center panel there. And the task force has been working really hard on establishing that. Probably a few things to point out there: the social determinants addition, also the drug coding system is going to be changed, and so we'll update you on that more when we can. Also, MBI, mild behavioral impairment, and SCD, subjective cognitive decline, also being added in one way or another. So a lot of things going on as far as changing this, and we'll give you some updates on when that can be done. But please come to the clinical task force session tomorrow, and you'll find out a whole lot more directly from the people who are working on this, and it won't be filtered through my view at that point. Okay. Also, in July, we put out a second version of the COVID impact survey. And so we'd urge you all in your centers to fill out those forms on everybody, really, because you'll need a much more complete look to see just what's going on, kind of as a, if you want, a post-marketing surveillance kind of aspect of people who may have had COVID and had vaccines or no vaccines, or just what their experiences were with regard to the impact on their possible cognitive decline, or just how they fared health-wise. So please fill those out. Try to get them to every one of your participants, and the data is going to be very useful. You'll hear more about this other COVID study as we also move along. Something we're working on as an admin supplement, so you'll hear much more about that in the next session as well. Here are the leads for the clinical task force. I don't want to spend too much time, but all of these people, plus the rest of the committee, have just put in a huge amount of work over the last year, really, and maybe longer than that, trying to make the UDS better for all of us, and so they all deserve your thanks and appreciation. As Nina mentioned, NAC is really undergoing a large modernization in the way we're looking at things. The things that we're trying to do, the data streams that we're trying to bring in, and the kind of revamping our entire database under a new cloud-based system and this other data warehouse called Flywheel, to make it much more easy to accept, ingest, and distribute lots of different data streams. And then we're also working closely with NCRAD and SCAN and the ADGC and NIGADS to make much better, much more seamless contacts and access to data from those studies through what we've termed as the data front door, so that you can come through NAC to be able to make contacts or to view the metadata. And we're continuing to work on that to make that much easier also. But come to the NAC session, and you'll hear a lot more about this and a lot more details. Also, our new investigators, these are our brand new investigators that started in July, the new investigator awards, $135,000 a year, so that they can do work that they proposed. These were all reviewed by the Scientific Review Committee, which you probably remember from the last meeting. And so they're all working hard at doing these projects, and I'm sure you'll hear much more from them as time goes on. Maybe in the next meeting we can have some reports from them on what they've done so far. And in that vein, we also have a new call out for new investigator awards, and we'll have 2 awards available this time. And one of those is going to focus on DEI aspects, even though DEI is a cross-cutting theme anyway. We decided along with the ADRC Executive Committee and our steering committee, that it would be a great idea to have one that was focused more on DEI research. So more information about that, a little bit of that is in your folder, and we'll talk more about that also this afternoon. So here are a lot of the different things that you'll see in the afternoon session. Sarah Biber, Ben Keller, the COVID-19 supplement that Sean Mooney and Carrie Stevens and Melissa Lurch are going to tell you about. The SCAN initiative, that we've done a lot of work with SCAN and in terms of standardizing, getting out the information about what the standard protocol is and keep the dashboards and so on. You'll be kind of amazed at what's going on there. And then also looking at some, what we call progressing towards the digital UDS, or we have called in the past digital biomarkers, some work that Rhode Island has been doing with the task force that we're beginning to put together some pilot work on. And also the new NAC directory, we've translated part, we're in phase 1 of taking our directory into REDCap so that it's much more available and accessible, and you'll hear more about that from Laura McLeod also. Okay, so you can connect with me at any time you like. Just send me an email, probably the easiest way, and I'll try to respond to you. And I think I'm about on time here, so I'll say, maybe I'll say something here. I'm waiting for my slide to change, but I guess it doesn't. So anyway, I'm out of time. That's what my slide was. All my slide said was thank you anyway. So wasn't any big deal, I guess. But anyway, I'm sure happy to be here. I hope you all are happy as well. Thanks.
Okay, the next presentation by Dr. Tatiana Faroud. As you all know, she is the PI of NICRED and also the NINDS-funded Biospecimen Exchange for Neurological Disorder, the BioSEN program. In addition, she's the Executive Associate Dean for Research Affairs and also the Distinguished Professor and Chancellor's Professor at Indiana University School of Medicine. Dr. Faroud, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to use 1 minute of my time, only because I'm tempted from that really nice introduction, just to tell you, for those of you who knew Mike Keneally, he was my mentor, and for those of you who are really young, sorry for the story, he was once at a trial and was asked by the defense, he was working for the prosecution, you've got this title, Distinguished Professor. Is this something you gave yourself? And if you didn't know him, he was an Irishman with just such charm, and he just looked at him and said, if I was going to do it myself, I would have been a very distinguished professor. So I love to tell the story. It keeps him alive for all of us. Just a wonderful man. Let's see if I know how to operate this. Okay, so I'm here, and it's really delighted to see all of you again, and I will speak quickly to make sure I use my time well. I'm going to basically largely talk about fluid biomarkers. So I decided where do I have the most impact? What would you most like to hear? So I'm going to start by talking about the Alzheimer's Disease Center Fluid Biomarker Initiative. We talked about this as COVID was setting in, and we're worried whether or not this would be able to be a successful initiative. So this is a blood-only initiative that many of you are involved in, and this is to create a greater resource of samples from the well-characterized individuals participating in the ADRCs. So we've always worked with you for a decade, more than a decade, around DNA, but this was to expand the collection to also include RNA, plasma, serum, and PBMCs. And I don't need to tell you why that's important. Okay, so the key is it's going to be shared, and now I'll give you a moment, you can look in the slides, see where your center is. You're all very competitive, so you can go see how you compare to everybody else. But the key the initial goal was to collect samples from 3,000 individuals. And I look at Cerise, and I want her to see that bottom number, and I want you to see 2,923. Just give me, I'm so close. All right, just give me like a couple weeks and I will be at 3,000. But, you know, we were really worried when COVID set in, would we be able to get this work done? And I just wanted to start by thanking all of you. You have come back from COVID with a wonderful collection. You've got your individuals coming back in and have really been able to create a fantastic resource in terms of samples. You can see DNA and plasma. Everyone who's participating is doing both of those. And then you can see other samples. You might go, you told me this was blood, and what are you doing with CSF in your column? I have two centers, and call them out, Arizona and Yale, who said, could I send you CSF as well? And of course, I'm never going to say no to CSF. So I want to particularly give a thanks to them. So I want to give you a feel for where this is going. So it's not like 3,000 is the end point. 3,000 was our first goal. Could we get people to participate? If we follow our trajectory, and like anything with trajectories, you get to kind of give your good estimate of where you think things are going. But I think you're going to see that the tealy color is what we've already got collected. Purple is what we're anticipating. And we think we're on track that by the end of 2023, we're going to have samples from 6,000 visits. So that, if we continue on the trajectory, very excited because that's creating a wonderful resource for research. But I also want to say it's also going to create data, as we've tried to do, to make added value to the centers for participating in efforts like this. So the way we're doing that, for those of you who were at the meeting or listened to the meeting in the spring, Jeff Daig presented on a new biomarker assay laboratory that we developed as part of NCRAD, as part of an administrative supplement. So the main things I want to make sure you understand about this is the lab is offering qualified, commercially available assays. We're doing that with internal qualification that evaluates precision, dilutional linearity, parallelism, and spike recovery. We're doing lot-to-lot bridging. That's going to become very important as we continue on here. That's going to allow us to have strong comparability between studies and lots. And I've got a little bit of information on equipment. So you heard about Jeff when you came in the spring. I have Kristen Russ with me, and at the end I'm going to have a couple people stand up so you can see people here from NCRAD. So what I'm really excited about, and I was really pleased to already start to get emails from you, is we've already run over 2,500 of the samples that we have, and I've got their information back, have started to now return data back, and just before this meeting, I will confess, looking for a bit of a splash and a thanks, a whole bunch of centers got data back. And so if you didn't realize you got data back from NAC, you want to go look. And if you want to know a little bit more, have any questions, some people wanted to ask questions about IDs, glad to meet with any of you, want to make sure that everyone has seen that that data is there, and make sure if you've got any questions that we can answer that. So we're really pleased. And our plan now is you're going to continue to get data back quarterly, as long as you're sending samples to us as part of that fluid biomarker initiative. And certainly hope to be able to continue to do that long term with you. So the one thing I want to remind you is there's also you're not going to go to the bank too far with this, but I want to remind you there's some financial reimbursement in order to be able to participate in these efforts. And I realize everything's gone up in cost. This reimbursement has not, so please forget about inflation, at least for this 5 minutes that I'm here. We're still providing through NAC $50 for each Buffy coat, which is our source of DNA, $50 for each plasma. And again, we're trying to have added value for all of you. So what we have is we're providing GWAS data back, we're providing ApoE genotyping. You get your ApoE genotyping and GWAS, that comes back through NAC. So hopefully that's a very familiar mechanism. And now we've added to that the plasma biomarker data that you'll be getting back. Trying to now make sure we do this on a quarterly basis so you can count on that. We've heard from you not knowing when we're going to get it, not having that direct return, knowing that you can count on it was challenging for centers. We're trying to make sure that we can do that efficiently. Other thing I want to make sure to add is everyone wants to know about p-tau217. So do we, and so of course does Jeff, as the person who developed it at Lilly. So we are also, of course, planning to make that commercially available. Something that a lot of people have asked about as well is how do we know what's going to be coming and going as there's new assays that are being developed? One of the things we're very conscious of is you can't be constantly just switching from one assay to another, the confusion that's going to be creating. So our plan is to have continuity across assays. Yes, we're going to have 181, we'll then be adding 217 to that. We'll then be able to work with all of you and work with the community to ask, do we transition then completely to 217? How long do we continue to have 181? And our plan is to continue to roll out new biomarkers each year. So I want to make sure this feels like a discussion. An important part of what we do is to support the research at the Alzheimer's centers. Want to make sure that we're doing that in effective partnership with you. Okay. So I'm actually really fast. So I'm going to make people get up, and then I'm going to apologize that I don't have a picture of one person. So Kelly Faber's not here. Any of you looking for Kelly Faber? She's in Indiana watching us, I think. But if I could have them stand up. So Kristen Russ, I mentioned in terms of the biomarker lab, is right there. Next to her is Casey Lacey. Many of you have worked with Casey. And then next to her is Stephanie Steidel. And I am so sorry, Stephanie. I should have had you and not Kelly, and I apologize. All right, that's really all I have. I figure y'all take my questions during the Q&A. And I don't know, give me the same amount of time next time, and I'll stuff more slides in. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, Tatiana. The next presentation is by Dr. Lee San Wang. Dr. Wang is professor of pathology and laboratory medicine and the founding co-director of the Penn Neurodegeneration Genomics Center at University of Pennsylvania. He is the PI of the NIH Genetics of Alzheimer's Disease Data Storage, the NIGADS, and NPI of the Genome Center for Alzheimer's Disease. He's also the founding PI of the Asian cohort of Alzheimer's disease at UPenn. Please give me a hand to welcome Dr. Wang. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, for the introduction. Let me see, how do I use this? Oh, the green arrow, yes. Oh, okay. Oh, here, yes. All right, so I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's genetics data today. And there it is, yes. And especially, some of these are related to the theme of diversity and inclusion today. The first is NIGADS, as you know, is the NIGADS is the NI designated repository for Alzheimer's genetics and genomics data. And we have all kinds of data in our repository, from GWAS SNP arrays to sequencing to RNA-seq and omics data. And they're all available for investigators to apply for. And the other thing we do a lot is to support the ADSP, Alzheimer's Disease Sequencing Project, that Eliezer mentioned during his presentation. So the idea of this strategic project is to find new genes, genetic association for Alzheimer's, and then use these to better understand disease as well as find new therapeutic approaches. And along the spectrum of goals, we have different components to support this. Start with the follow-up sequencing, that's for cohort expansion, especially for diversity. We have the phenotype harmonization consortium that's going to combine the different kind of clinical data and harmonize them so you can analyze together. Then the two new programs that Eliezer mentioned, Functional Genomics Consortium is going to generate functional studies and data to characterize these genetic findings. AI machine learning is going to use advanced data analytics approaches to explore these data, and they have very, very creative research questions they're going to explore. The biomarker discovery, as Tatiana mentioned, is very important. We want to make sure biomarker is done consistently, and we have a chance to explore the genetic connections. And there are different kind of infrastructure that support these components, and NACRAT, NAC, NIGADS, and so on. And there has been, the team has been instrumental to get all these things together. We just released our latest data release a few weeks ago. I hope you got our notification. This new release has more than 19,000 new genomes that have not been sequenced before. And we provide raw data. You can actually analyze the actual sequencing reads. But also, we have combined that with the previous release genome and generate joint call. So for every variant that you see in every sample, you have the genotype data across all the 36,000 genomes. So that's your complete data matrix that you can directly analyze. And it's a huge data. It has more than almost 400 million variants and really rich data. One other thing I want to point out is, as you can see from this pie chart, now we have more diversity cohort samples than non-Hispanic whites. And this is a trend that we're going to continue to work on. It's going to increase our statistical power as well as representation. Another feature for this data release, which I'm really proud to share with you, is we now have deep phenotypic data. And this is done by the Phenotype Harmonization Consortium, led by Tim Holman from Vanderbilt, Mike Kukro from Miami, and Arthur Toga from USC. And the first wave releases these harmonized data from 3 categories: cognition, biomarker, neuropath data, and it's done by a group of domain experts in these areas. So have the best scientific approaches and standards, and all these data with detailed documentation are available. And we're going to continue to work on this, and there will be more cohorts and more types of data, in particular imaging. ADSP, another component of ADSP is the Gene Verification Committee, and here we have the roster of the members, and they've been working really hard to review the literature of genetic studies, and they developed a tiered approach to assign confidence and quality information about the genetic loci we found. And NIGAS released the first draft table of top loci a few months ago, and we have the link here, and you can go to the ADSP and NIGAS website and find it. I think you'll find it really interesting. And all of these information are on the ADSP website, and we're working on an update, and we hope to get it out in the next few months. It's almost done. It needs to be reviewed to make sure things are properly, you have the content updated. But it has really rich information, and I think the design team did a great job. It's very visually appealing. So when it's come out, we're going to notify everybody. Now, one of the bottlenecks, as you all know, is we need more diversity for genetic research, especially. And I have this story that you all know. The ApoE gene, the E4 allele, turns out to have very different effect sizes for different populations. And I don't think we really know why that's the case. And as you can imagine, if we crack this, it's going to have really important insights on AD biology. And that's the same kind of thing. We have the same story for other genetic findings in Alzheimer's and pretty much all the disease research in general. Most of the samples and most of the findings are about European ancestry, and we need to invest more in the other populations to, again, increase statistical power and also increase representation. So that's why we have this new program, and I announced this new program a few months ago, the follow-up sequencing project that initiative that Eliezer mentioned. It's an ambitious project to increase representation, increase diversity in the 3 populations that we mentioned here: African, Hispanic, and Asian ancestry. And Dr. Peggy Vance is going to talk more about this in her presentation later. But this RFA covers different aspects of data generation, cohort expansion, analysis. So if you have any questions about this RFA, feel free to talk with the NI program officers, or if I can help, let me know. Now, I want to talk about Asian samples, and this I'm more directly involved in this. And with the cohort expansion in ADSP, there are already cohorts that are studying Asian samples. These are in Asia. We're talking about 2 studies that are sequencing Korean cohorts. One is the Esprit sample in Australia that have a few hundred subjects that are Asian ancestry. And the last one is the Indian cohort that has been going on many, many years with really rich phenotypes, and we're going to sequence several thousand samples that have good cognitive tests and diagnosis. Well, that talks about Asian Americans. With that cohort expansion, we face a different kind of challenge. It's a smaller population. The base number is smaller, so it's a more challenge for recruitment. Many of them are immigrants. They don't necessarily speak English. They're not as mobile. They can just come to the Alzheimer's centers. And you need bilingual staff. You need to connect with the community. You need to build a trust. There are a lot of challenges. And it needs time. It needs people dedicated to work these through. So, I and many others, and many of the people here actually have been contributing to this project, work together to figure out how to solve these problems for probably like 4 years. And I'm also very grateful that NIA sees the importance of this and funded us through a 2-year pilot study to recruit, and we're doing pretty well, I think. Our goal is to recruit 1,000 subjects. We're focusing on Chinese because of language challenges. That's what we're focusing on. And we started recruiting about this time last year, and we have many people on the waiting list, more than like 1,400, and we're reaching about half of the target at this moment. There's a lot of feedback, like response. The community is enthusiastic about this study. But eventually we need to have more. So we have enough statistical power. We're also working on Korean and Vietnamese populations, and tackling with translation is a challenge, but I think we figure out. We have the protocol for cultural approach recruitment and data collection, and we want to collect DNA for genetics and plasma biomarkers, in this case, NACRA has been instrumental. And this is the protocol we came up with. And it will look familiar to all of you because a lot of them are based on UDS. And I want to thank Bud for his support. He's an ACAI investigator from the beginning. And also a lot of them is based on the epidemiological cohorts from University of Columbia. Richard Mayo has been building these cohorts. We learned a lot from him about how to build an epidemiological cohort for genetics efficiently. So, summary, I think we're going to have this really rich data for dementia research, Alzheimer's genetic research with more diversity. And a key point is leveraging existing cohorts, and the ADRC program has been really instrumental. I want to thank all of you on so many levels. These things won't be happening without your help and high quality work. So I think I'm out of time, and thank you so much.
I think we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. If you want to use the mic stands, come to the mic stand there. And if I could have Bud and Tatiana come back to the stage, please.
Well, thank you for those really nice presentations. Eric Ryman from Arizona. Lisan, I was just curious. There could be such great value of having blood-based biomarker endophenotype in everybody in the ADGC if they're a living participant, including overcoming some challenges with using clinical data in underrepresented groups for a rare condition, not being screwed by having a misdiagnosed case or a control with preclinical AD. The numbers who have biomarkers right now are relatively small, but I wonder if there's a mechanism that blood will be available in all of them so that you will eventually be able to get those blood-based biomarker endophenotypes.
Yep, Tatiana can answer that.
All right, so let me try to help. So I think I want to start by saying, the enthusiasm around blood-based biomarkers, plasma in particular, is enormous. So one of the things that I think NIA has been trying to do deliberately is make sure that we can have multiple laboratories generating data, but also be able to combine them on the back end. So some of you are familiar with Jeff Daig. Part of what he's been advocating in a number of different settings, starting with the Alzheimer's centers, but now also in the ADGC and in the ADSP, is that across the sets of laboratories that are going to be generating plasma-based biomarkers, we have common samples that we're using so that we can ensure that we're going to be able to combine on the back end and to have a regular program of quality in which we're not just doing this once when we set things up, but that we're doing this on a regular basis throughout the year. So that's the first part, is to recognize that this is going to need to be done in multiple laboratories. I think the second piece is, are there existing samples for some of these individuals that are participating in ADGC studies where we can bring those to these laboratories to be assayed? Or do we need to have uniform protocols where we can add the collection of plasma? So it's sort of two different questions. From the NICRAD end, we've been seeking out studies that are part of ADGC or ADSP. Can we work with them in order to be able to add plasma collection if that isn't already there? But I want to put a call out that if there are studies that are part of those entities that have plasma, there's also efforts within all these consortia to try to make sure we can get them to laboratories so that they can be run. Does that answer your question?
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
I want to comment on how incredible these efforts are, and the diversity inclusion is really important. I have become aware, though, that when you say plasma samples that we can distribute, that means turning each individual into a pincushion. And I'm really feeling the feedback from the participants that say, I'm not going to give you this much every time. I'm just tired of this. I won't come in if you're asking for blood. And I am a little concerned that as we have local efforts and national efforts, we need to think about ways to establish how much is too much, how often is too often. And I think not only the voice of the science, but of the people in the community need to be included. And I am a little worried that we are thinking of blood as a fountain that comes to us. It's just so easy to get blood, and even that assumption is not quite as true as we think. And so I really, you know, I was excited to hear that you're supporting the collection of, you know, plasma, et cetera, but I have 5 other investigators who are NIH funded, who belong to many of these other collaborations that are expecting the same sample size of blood. We have to shape this more carefully if we really do care about diverse participants.
Can I ask you, wait, don't leave yet, Mary. Can you go back to the, can I ask you a question? And so I think it's what's great about this meeting is to be able to do it as a dialogue. So one of the things, and I guess I want to ask in response to what I said to Eric's question, if we had better coordination about having the assays that were sort of core assays, let's start with that, not exploratory, but core, that we would have the ability to be able to know that it was done once and could be broadly shared, again, in laboratories where we know that we've got that coordination. And do you feel like that's at least that's in the right direction of trying to be respectful of let's not be collecting multiple times to do the same thing? That's my first question. I think
so let me just
go ahead,
because I think that's an important point, and I have never denied a centralized sample. I think that's really critical, but I think many assays are still at the development level, and that I'm not convinced that centralizing is the right way to go. Let the development happen, and when we have more conviction, then maybe we can bring together or say, no, we're going to centralize it. I'm just not convinced, so.
I didn't mean centralized with me either. I just want to be honest that I wasn't being self-serving. I just want to make sure I say that, because it could be within the center. I'm guessing Charlie's got a comment too. Go ahead.
But there's no one better. So.
I'm confident Charlie has a comment.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to come back to saying the same thing I've said. Okay, so here we are again. We have multiple studies. As has been stated, they're doing these things. We're getting these samples. We have them. And I say, why not let some central, where we can just give it to the NAC, for example. We have already hundreds in our cohort that have gotten all of these measures on the 4-plex. And longitudinally. Similarly, we have other grants that are doing exactly the same thing. It seems to me that people who have NAC IDs should then be able to share with this so that we can give this, so that we're not repeatedly going back to people and asking for 60 cc's of blood every time they come in.
That's exactly what I'm suggesting. So
good.
If it could be, yeah, I just want to be clear. That's exactly what we're, so the first thing is around, can we, whether it's a NAC ID or the frightful GUID, but something that would allow us to recognize it's the same person. I would just start with that.
Yeah.
And the one thing I'd ask, and my guess is most of these large studies are using laboratories that are doing this. Can the laboratories where these studies are being done, can we have as many as we can be part of this common compliant, I don't want to say compliance in an onerous way.
That's a great
so
idea.
that we've got common samples. That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Charlie.
Perfect.
There is no lab, in my opinion, that could run everybody's samples.
Right.
We're way beyond that. So what I'm advocating for is this coordination model so that we can, with confidence, combine the data on the back end, because that's what we need.
And as you know, it doesn't take a lot, so we could send small aliquots if you needed it to replicate, to just confirm, et cetera.
I want the laboratory you're working with to be part of the compliance.
Okay.
That, to me, is the magic of this whole thing. We need a whole bunch of we can't do GWAS all in one place. We can't do all these things. We need that. And we want to make sure we have samples that can be also part of exploratory work.
One more question for genetic analysis. Can you just kind of give us your thoughts about how your approach will be going forward to look at not only the diversity, in terms of race and country of origin, but also social determinants of health? How will that be accounted? You're going to have a lot of variability in your diverse samples, and a lot of variability has nothing to do with race. And so just can you kind of tell us how you're going to approach or address the other factors that contribute?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a really big challenge. When we're talking about the ACAT study design, we're thinking about the kind of social determinants that we're going to collect. But as we're just starting, so we want to make sure we have a core set of questions that we know we can definitely implement. And there are things we can compute, like the deprivation index. That's actually in our research plan. And the other thing is, it's like unless we have that kind of data, it's really hard to do this kind of analysis. So genetics alone doesn't answer that. I want to point out that by studying Asian Americans and Asians in Asia, that's a good opportunity to study the environmental impact because their genetics are similar, but their lifestyle, diets, language are so different. So it's an amazing opportunity. And the rest really relies on the creativity of investigators. Yeah, there's a lot of challenge. I think that's all I can say at this moment. Thank you.
Henrik Zetterberg from University of Wisconsin and also University of Gothenburg. I have a comment regarding this possibility of harmonizing in laboratories. And that's actually something I think we could do in this network quite well. There are resources already now to look at, and that's the Alzheimer's Association QC program, which is expanding now for blood biomarkers as well.
Yes, yes.
But that will those data will never be able to, we can't use them to harmonize the laboratories. But if a laboratory and you have a cohort where you will do a larger biomarker analysis, if one could, potentially from ICRAD, I think we have discussed it a bit, Tatjana, provide, say, 50 samples where we have multiple aliquots that could be run along with that cohort, then we could assure that we could first prove that the measurements are comparable, and if they are not, we could also make the data comparable by factorizing the markers that are a little bit off, because that often happens with research-grade assays.
Totally agree, and I know I'm out of time. So that's one of the things. So for those of you who don't know and haven't written a letter to help me, we did a competitive revision, and one of the things is precisely that, is actually to do large collections of AD and control individuals so that we have large volumes so we can precisely be able to provide same samples across a number of states. So we built that in, and obviously to continue to be able to provide assays. But absolutely, that's absolutely critical. And we want to build on existing efforts. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel.
So, hi, Rodo from the BU ADRC. So I just wanted to make a comment about, I think we have a little bit of a chicken and egg problem when we're talking about exploratory biomarkers if we only depend on what we already have, right? So, because if we're going to create exploratory biomarkers on the samples we have are highly biased. So we actually have to create a way in which to do the exploratory part in a much more representative way, right? So I just want to make sure we don't lose that perspective.
Good morning, everyone. Joyce Bossberry, or Joy, from Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. So a couple of questions and a couple of thoughts that have come up. When we think about GWAS studies, many times those studies have underrepresentation based on different ancestry. And I know that from work I've done previously with biobanking and bipolar disorder, and I'm sure the same can be said for ADRD. So if we're thinking about a more centralized process, what resources will be available to train those laboratories on a standardized system so that we are not further marginalizing communities of color and under-resourced communities. My second question relates to thinking about structural vulnerability and social determinants of health as additional biomarkers that we often don't consider when we are talking to communities, and as a colleague mentioned earlier about participant fatigue. So if we think about participant fatigue in terms of asking people to return often to either answer our questions or to give more blood or to give things for a microbiome, how do we ensure that we are not further marginalizing communities of color who may not have transportation to get there or may not have a study partner or may not have other things in order to engage in our research? Thank you.
Can you not, can I ask you to come back again? So can I, and I guess, I'm
Surely.
so sorry if I'm going too long, but so one of the things we've done, and I'm sure the others will have comment about this as well. So I didn't directly address it because I'm waiting to see what happens with our competitive revision. So one of the things that we recognize is the way we've been, we have a very limited number of individuals, I would say, who are participating that have banked samples with us as NICRAD, and we don't do most of the recruitment, so we're dependent on the studies that do. But it's largely around studies that are not in the community, but are studies that are coming, people are coming to a center, which I think, that's why I wanted to start right here. Mm-hmm. So we worked with Damali Martin at NIA to try to start to talk about what studies are recruiting, particularly focused on variety, I don't want to define in terms of underrepresented in research studies, individuals who are more diverse, starting with studies that perhaps are in a more, if I can call them traditional setting, coming to an academic center. But I know she's planning to have a workshop, and I don't want to say now if it's in the spring, but I think the plan was in the spring, that was thinking about more community-based studies to bring those researchers together to talk about how would you try to be engaging individuals in studies that would be involving, for my part, around sampling. How would you do that in a way that could be done in a community to reduce burden? How would you need to develop protocols? How would you need to be able to have individuals who be working with those participants?
So one of the things that I think that NIA has done very well was the R24 mechanism, and I am an R24 PI. And I think through that process of many of us creating registries where we're working directly with under-resourced communities, underrepresented groups, and many of us have community advisory boards and governance boards and the like. So I think that that's a good first step, for sure. But I also think that as we're developing protocols, many times we don't even have that community voice at the table from the design process. You know what I mean? So it goes back to that as well. We'll submit our NIH grants or PCORI or the like, and that patient caregiver voice is not there to help answer the questions that we've been asking about today. So, so I think that R24 PI group is a good place to start as well. And I don't know if others agree, but, it's another way of engaging us.
Yes, maybe I can comment a little bit in addition to what, and I think you made all very, very important points, and we have similar experience with putting the ACAT together. One of the things we did with NACRA is actually figure out a way to collect bloods and extract plasma and process locally so they don't need to come to the Alzheimer's centers. And it's absolutely important because a lot of studies we have to go to the community.
Exactly.
Yes, so we're working on that.
Together.
We partnered together, Jeff Dage figured out on the fly with the ACAT team. So that's one of the many things we realized we have to deal with. For genetics, actually, from the pure genetic analysis perspective, we have a good sense about how to deal with genetic data from different populations, although there's still be more work to be done. Sample size is absolutely important. Without a sample size, you can't have enough genomes. You need to have better reference genomes that represent the different populations. The current reference genome is not enough. And I was talking about pangenome, but that's going to be a few years from now. So that also needs more work. And I would say the last thing is we need more investigators who are committed to the cause of the communities, know the needs of the communities to drive these efforts. Well, a lot of things we did with ACAD, including we have a community advisory board. So they tell us what they see and tell us how we design our study, including recruitment and retention, honorarium, and some of the things. I sit in office most of the time, so I wouldn't know what a challenge. And these advice are absolutely important. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you all for coming. We're going to take a 5-minute break now. There is some snacks and drinks out in the foyer.
I think it's time for us to start our scientific presentations. Please, you can take your seats. We'll start on time here. Okay. So the next presentation is by Dr. Lisa Barnes. Dr. Barnes is the Ella V. and Solomon Jesmer Professor of Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine at the Rush University Medical Center. She also serves as the Associate Director of the ADRC and leads their clinical core. Dr. Barnes is internationally renowned for her research interests in health disparities in chronic diseases and health disparities in aging-associated diseases, especially in older Black and the various social and environmental factors, how they affect the diagnosis and care of people with this disease. It truly is a pleasure to invite Dr. Barnes to make a presentation on social determinants of health and health equity. Dr. Barnes.
Let's see. Good morning. Oh, it is blinding. Welcome to Chicago, everybody, my city. I'm so happy to see everyone in real life and welcome you here. It's been like forever for me to be in person with people. I want to thank the executive committee for the invitation to be part of this really exciting session on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The whole theme of this meeting is awesome, and thank you to all of the Zoom people watching. I wish you could be here with us. I have the distinct honor to provide sort of a broad overview of social determinants of health and health equity. Sadly, Sanjay already gave my talk, so I don't have much to add, but I do have, let's see, how can I do it? Can you see that? Okay. I just have 3 main objectives that I want to cover today. And I'm going to flip the agenda from my title and start with health equity. What is it? Why should we care? And then talk about social determinants and how they relate to brain health. And then provide what I hope is a concrete action plan to move us forward in this area as a consortium. So we have been talking about health equity for a long time, well, not a long time, over the past couple years or 2.5 years since all of the things that have happened in society. And so I know we all know what it is, but for the purpose of this presentation, I thought it'd be great to have a definition that we could all work with. And so health equity is when everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. And there's many illustrations of that construct, but this is my new favorite because it really lays out so clearly what the issues are. So on the upper left quadrant, you can see what inequality looks like. So, and I cannot see that far. Oh, there we go. So unequal access to opportunities. You have these 2 people trying to get the apples. One person can clearly get the apples. The other person's like, where are the apples? When we move to equality, then we give both of the people a ladder so they can both reach the tree to get the apples. So we have evenly distributed tools and assistance, but you see that the apples are still hard to get for that one person. So equity is giving people what they need when they need it in the amount that they need. So that one person gets a taller ladder, so we are able to customize tools that identify and address inequality, but still, the person can get a couple of apples, but it's still not like the other person, right? So what we need to move to is justice, where we fix the tree. we put some stakes in it and move the tree over so that we can evenly distribute the apples or the opportunities, where we're fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. Now, we're not even at equity yet, right? But justice is where we would like to be eventually. And so why is this important? Well, it's because so many disparities still exist. And I'm going to just give you a few examples of what these disparities are. So life expectancy, there are huge disparities in life expectancy among racial, ethnic groups. They're widespread and enduring. So these are county level data from across the US from 2000 to 2019, and you can see that African Americans and American Indian or Alaska Natives have the lowest life expectancy of all the other groups, even though overall life expectancy is increasing. Similarly, you can look at mortality rates. All-cause mortality rates are much higher for those same two groups, non-Hispanic blacks and non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaska Natives, compared to the other groups. And in fact, you can look at almost any health outcome, and you can see that people of color fare worse than their white counterparts across many measures of health status. These are data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and the orange bars are showing you where people of color are doing worse than their white counterparts. And then, of course, in our own backyard, we have these noted disparities in dementia incidence between African Americans and, again, American Indian and Alaska Natives. These are well-known data from Kaiser. But even if you look in the VA, where there's equal access to care, you still see that age-adjusted incidence of dementia is consistently higher among older Hispanic, Black, and Asian participants. If we look at HRS, we can see that if you are non-Hispanic white or have at least a college degree, you are significantly more likely to receive a timely diagnosis of dementia or MCI than if you are non-Hispanic Black or Hispanic or have less than a college degree. So these disparities are out there. They exist. And we've talked about them a lot now. We're all like woke, right? But is it anything new, really? Or is it just really old wine in new bottles? Because back in 1903, W.E. Du Bois, a noted sociologist, talked about the issues that we face as a country. And he said, in part, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the question as to how far differences of race are going to be made the basis of denying to over half the world the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. Now, he wasn't talking about health disparities per se, but even, over 100 years later, if you are African American born in this country, you will live sicker and die younger than your white counterparts. You are over twice as likely to live in poverty. You experience less upward economic mobility. You're far less likely to own your own home, and you have a family median wealth that is less than 1/10 that of white families. And although those are statistics for African Americans, other communities of color and marginalized groups experience similar burdens of disadvantage. So we can't talk about these disparities without addressing the elephant in the room. And I tried to hide the elephant with those lines, but the elephant is clear, right? Racism is the elephant in the room. And, racism and other forms of social oppression listed on this slide are really the key drivers of social determinants of health that lead to poor health outcomes and ultimately to these health disparities. So you say, okay, fine, but why should we care about that? Well, we should care because the perception of the people we're trying to help is illustrated with these data from the Alzheimer's Association, where they held focus groups. And I just pulled out two of the questions. People of color are much more likely to believe that medical research is biased against people of color, and they are significantly less likely to believe or trust that an Alzheimer's cure will be shared equally, regardless of race, color, or ethnicity. So these are the people we're trying to help, right? And when we look at our research landscape, a study came out in 2021. I'm sorry, the citation is not showing, but it's Birkin Bill, I think. They looked at about 8 large studies and found that about 80% of the information we're getting in Alzheimer's is coming from self-identified white people. And you can see the breakdown for the other groups. So we're getting an incomplete narrative from the people who are essentially deemed invisible because they're not in our studies. And these are the people who are most at risk, most of the time, right? So you have this problem of an incomplete narrative. I would argue that you also have too few narrators, because if we look at NIH data, it's very clear that minoritized populations are less likely to be R01 grantees or be in the STEM doctoral workforce compared to their representation in the US society. So this becomes a real issue for us. We have an incomplete narrative and we have too few narrators, right? So let's turn to social determinants, the things that we think might help us understand more about what's going on in brain health. So we know now that most of our health is influenced by factors outside the walls of a hospital. And you'll see different percentages presented in different papers, but the point is only about 10% of your health is actually due to clinical care. There are all these other things outside, including the social and economic factors that seem to be more important or have a bigger impact on your health than clinical care. And so we think about social determinants of health. And what are these? These are the contexts into which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, right? And so there's many different definitions of social determinants. I like the one from the Healthy People 2030. And it basically has 5 categories. And it kills me when people say, well, you only can measure social determinants in people of color. No, everybody is born into a context, right? What it is that there's a systematic and unjust distribution of economic, social, and environmental conditions needed for health that becomes the problem. But we have to be able to measure those things. And so we know that these kinds of things matter for brain health. There's data from the Health ABC showing that lower socioeconomic status is related to higher dementia risk. So if you have less than a high school education, your literacy level is less than 9th grade, and you have less than 10,000 family income, you're going to have a higher dementia risk. And in some cases, it's even worse if you're a Black person. Also, illiteracy is related to higher odds of dementia. This is work coming out of YCAP. And I just found this paper recently that I thought was so interesting. They did a literature review of all of the papers that looked at race, education, quality, and dementia. And they found through some fancy modeling that if education quality was equalized, racial disparities in dementia would be reduced by 50%. So that's pretty huge, right? But it's not just these education buckets that matter. We also know that stress is important. So, these data out of Kaiser show that midlife stressors are associated with elevated risk of dementia. And work from Rush, out of our group, shows that experiences of discrimination and school segregation is associated with poorer cognition in African Americans. So these are actual experiences, but it's not just the experience, it's also the perception, just the perception that your life is harder, right? So greater perceived stress is associated with cerebral infarction and lower brain volume in CHAP, another of our studies at Rush, and we've shown that greater perceived stress is associated with faster cognitive decline in Mars. And then, of course, we have all of the neighborhood data that's coming out showing that neighborhood segregation and access to resources is really important. Exposure to residential segregation throughout young adulthood was associated with worse processing speed among Black participants. These are data from Cardia. And then you have similar studies out of YCAP, Regards, and HRS showing very similar associations. So moving outside the individual to their social context in which they live. So what is an action plan that we all as a consortium can try to move forward and really, galvanize around? Well, one thing is, that last spring we presented a module called Social Determinants of Health. This was a working group led by myself and Dr. Zilsdorf at University of Wisconsin to add more questions to the UDS. Now, currently in the exam, we have a few social determinants questions, listed here on the slide. And yes, we do have ADI, but we wanted to take a deeper dive to get into some issues that you cannot get to with just public databases or just relying solely on the ADI. So we have this new proposed form that's under review, and essentially we are looking at just 4 constructs. So transportation security, financial security and stress, social isolation, connectedness, healthcare seeking experience. Now, I'm not going to go through the boxes. What I did was I highlighted and underlined the 2 boxes where the data are most robust, where we have just a lot of evidence supporting that these are important for brain health. The other 2, transportation security and healthcare seeking, are clearly important conditions for people, especially older adults, but we don't have a lot of data on how they might affect brain health. So we added those as a proposal. So just to give you a little snapshot of how we went about this, we used solid criteria to select the constructs. We had a committee of experts on social determinants that represented 10 ADRCs, including P30s and P20s, and representatives from NIA. We did a robust literature review and looked for the availability of validated instruments, and we tried to harmonize with existing studies and toolkits where possible. And again, we wanted to pick constructs that were not available through geocoding or linkage with public databases. We sent out the surveys to the centers, and we got a robust response, including over 120 comments from at least 31 ADRCs. Now, I'm going to be optimistic and say that that means you were really into it and not that you hated the idea. But, we incorporated the feedback. The co-chairs revised the form. We presented it to the clinical task force, and it's programmed by NAC, and it's ready to deploy after a few more boxes have been checked off. But we need you. It's an optional form, but we really need everybody to try to do this. It's self-administered by the participant, so obviously it's people without dementia who will be taking this. It takes less than 10 minutes, and 5 minutes if you're, have no cognitive impairment. And we're only asking you to do it one time. If you want to do it longitudinally, go for it. But at least one time. We have so many centers, so many people that we could really be pioneers in this area and link these data to things that are not in the literature, biomarkers and imaging and genetics, all the things that we do as a center. Now we can link social determinants to it, but we can't just have a few centers who are interested in doing it. We need all of you. So that's one thing we can do as a concrete plan, right? Collect data on social determinants. The second thing we can do is to increase diversity in our centers. I looked at the current NAC report, and similar to that published paper I talked about, 80% of NAC participants are self-identified white adults, and you can see the breakdown for the other groups, 14% Black, 9% Hispanic of any race. So we can do better in that area. Right now, our centers are very selective, right? So let's align with the conversations we've had earlier. Let's go out there and try to get more people to be attracted to what we do and invited to our centers. So that's the second action plan. The third one is we can increase training opportunities to diversify the ADRD workforce. So I found this paper. This is not our center, our consortium. This is an AD RICMAR, so NIA-funded RICMAR that's focused on Alzheimer's disease. And they talked about a training program to diversify the academy in Alzheimer's disease research. And they laid out 3 key points. Fund pilot projects for underrepresented minorities conducting research on social determinant factors that influence ADRD disparities, provide mentorship to build research capacity, because a lot of times, our underrepresented minority scholars might need a bit more mentorship, based on having, lack of, coming from an underserved, research university, or just not having good mentorship when they were coming up. So providing mentorship so we can build research capacity. And then the third one, which I thought was really key, offering research education in health disparities and minority aging to all scientists and partners, not just those few in your center who are doing the research, who are interested. Everybody needs to learn about this because it's affecting all of us. So, have education so we can all rise up to the same level. And so that's the third, right? The fourth and final action plan is let's diversify our leadership. I'm so happy that 7 center directors are women of 37 centers. And plus we have 5 co-PIs who are women. Now let's go up half or more, right? Let's get more. Let's get some color in here too. But this is a great start. This is how we're gonna change the narrative, and move towards health equity. So I think it's time to stop talking about health equity and let's start acting, okay? So I just want to conclude by these few points. Health equity will allow us to level the playing field and pursue social and economic justice. Understanding the role of social determinants for brain health is critical because social inequities linked to racism and discrimination and also shaped by race, ethnicity, influence brain health. That's why we have to have more people in our studies and measure these things because they matter. And understanding social determinants could provide clues to understanding mechanisms of disparities in brain health as well as just brain health in general. So working as a team, as a consortium, let us make advances in data collection and diversifying our participant pool, our trainees, and our leaders. I thank you so much for your attention today, and let's really work together. Thank you.
Bravo, Lisa. Okay, we're going to do 5 minutes of questions as we are running a little over time, and we're going to start with one from the virtual audience.
So this question comes from Dr. Karen Bandine Roche, and she says, consideration of different cutoffs is indeed important. If one is not terribly careful, though, one may inadvertently introduce harmful algorithmic biases. I imagine research is needed to well strike this balance, but would be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I did not talk about cutoffs, but of course that is an important consideration, especially when we think about cognition and cognitive testing, where there are clear disparities. It might also be important in biomarkers. This is an area where we need more research. I don't have all the answers, and I don't know the best way to go about it. What we've done at Rush is we just heavily invest in longitudinal studies where we're comparing people to themselves, so we don't have to compare, to some normed standard. But clearly, every center cannot do that or doesn't have the capacity or the interest. So we need people to come together and start doing research in this area so that we can understand the importance of if we have to norm. I don't always agree with norming for cognition, but if, in some cases that might be important for diagnostic purposes. And then as we get more biomarker data, do we need cutoffs for those as we're seeing lower tau in African Americans? You're going to hear more about that in the other presentations. Yes.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm inspired. Are you guys inspired? Yeah. Thank you to Lisa and Megan and the entire committee. You guys worked really hard and did a great job. I want to thank you. I just want to ask you to repeat for everyone, which participants are we supposed to be looking at social determinants of health on and why?
We are asking that you look at social determinants in every participant that you have. Of course, those who have dementia won't be included, unfortunately. These are not questions that the proxy would answer, but people, from normal cognition all the way to MCI, maybe early AD is possible, but every person, including white people, you are born into a social context. It might be a really high and nice, cushy one, but it's there, and we need to measure it. So please, everybody gets these data points.
Thank you, Lisa. That was truly inspiring. And I have 2 points to make. One is, thank you for highlighting the female ADRC directors. I just want to point out, that's self-serving, but I do want to point out 2 sister directors, the Duke, Dr. Heather Whitson, Dr.
Stand
Glenn
up,
Garden.
stand up.
And Dr. Sudha Seshadri at UT. So your slide is going to be even bigger next year.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you.
So, and then I want to make a point. I totally agree that we need to provide to all of the scientists in our areas better education about health disparities in Alzheimer's disease, and I thought that was an excellent point. I wonder whether that could be facilitated by a committee that's focused on that topic, who puts together sort of a core set of materials. Because I know otherwise we're each coming up with our own. It's a bit of a duplication of effort, and a committee led by a person, say, such as yourself. At any rate, just a suggestion. I think that would be a great tool for us to have.
Yeah, that's a great point. Maybe we can even have the rec and the OR work together because they have more knowledge in those areas. Thank you for that. Yes,
Hi,
Dave.
Lisa. Great talk. David Marquez from the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center and a proud colleague of Dr. Barnes. So one of the social determinants of health that we know about is education, and people like yourself and Dr. Manley have talked about not only quantity of education, but quality of education. And so you and I can talk offline, but this is for the group as well. In immigrants, especially those from Latin America, we have a lot of Spanish-speaking people in our Latino core and in other cores across the U.S. I don't know the best way to measure that, right?
Yeah.
And so do you think what the measures that are used in Black Americans or African Americans could be also used in immigrants, or adapted, or it would be best to start over?
I think we probably need to have like a working group to talk about that because the issues are a little bit different. Black Americans, obviously, in the U.S. have the history of, racism and segregated schools and Jim Crow that influence education outcomes. Whereas immigrants, they may have been educated in another country, then they come here. So it's different issues. We might be able to start with some of the same measures, but in the module that we're proposing, we do try to ask about like your parents' education, to try to get more at, like the generational impact of some of these things. But I think a work group that specifically dives into different Latinx communities is going to be needed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you should lead it, Dave.
And one final question.
Lisa, thank you. Hank Paulson, University of Michigan.
Hey, Hank.
Third time inspiring. Thank you. One of the things we heard earlier today is that the concern about patients or research participants becoming pincushions. And we need to move, I think, in terms of having a broader reach to a wider segment of populations, turn those pincushions into sponges who soak up information from us. They do a better job of getting information about what their own disease or symptoms are, as well as how they can do a better job with it. My feeling in the ADRC network is that the OR cores are largely driving that effort, but they tend to be under-resourced. What are your recommendations, and maybe this is something to discuss over the next couple of years, that we as a group of a network of centers can do a better job in terms of having a way to actually facilitate the sponginess as opposed to the pincushiness?
Right, great points. I think the number one thing is that the OR core, they need more resources. So we need to have more money going towards the OR core, NIA. But also, I think it's not just up to them. So the other people in the center, they need to be able to go out and do these presentations. I have, I lead 2 cohorts, and I'm out there as much as the OR core people, giving retention talks and recruitment talks. So we have to have everybody taking part in this. You can't sit in your ivory tower, typing your papers and your grants and letting somebody else do the work. So I think more resources and more of us buying in and going out there is going to be the answer. But it's going to take, some time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes, for that superb presentation. Thank you. Okay, the next presentation is by Dr. Margaret Perisak-Vance. Dr. Perisak-Vance is Dr. John T. McDonald Foundation Professor of Human Genetics and Director of the John P. Hussman Institute for Human Genomics at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and is truly world-renowned for her research in health disparity in genomics. So please welcome Dr. Perisak-Vance to make a presentation entitled Genetics of Alzheimer's Disease in Marginalized Populations. Dr. Perisak-Vance.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right. I'm echoing. I don't know if that's coming from me or you. Hello? Okay, thank you. They removed the echo. All right, thank you. Thank you for the invite today. I'm so sorry I can't join you, but I'm stuck between two meetings that I have to go to, and it was just too much travel. I've certainly enjoyed the speakers before me. I think they did part of the work for me. And I know there are many of you experts in the field on genetics and diversity. And so I hope, though, everybody's able to take something back with them. Now my slide is not moving. Ah, there it goes. So this is a slide just in case anybody wants a reference point. Our goal with human genetics disease research is to find drug targets, to find new drug targets that may help directly treat Alzheimer's. Why study genes? Is because there's several papers now. There was only a few, but now several others have come out that genetic targets are twice as successful with drug trials versus non-genetic targets. Why should we study diverse groups? Is because almost all the risk factors that we've developed today have come from people from European ancestral descent. And as we'll see in this talk, and as many of you know, different ancestral groups have different genetic risk factors, and it's critical that we be able to make treatments universally translational. Previous speaker alluded to the differences, and some of the differences we see between Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are more likely to develop AD and dementia compared to non-Hispanic white individuals. And there's lots of reasons for these, certainly not all of them are genetic, mostly outside factors. But I think it's important that we look at the biological factors as well as the social determinants of health, because there are differences. And one thing we do not want to create is additional genomic health disparities to go along with the many health disparities we know currently exist. I'm sure many of you have seen this slide that shows up until about, I think this was published in 2019, almost all of what we call the genetic genome-wide association studies were done in people of European backgrounds. And if you look at the individuals from Hispanic, Asian, and African backgrounds, very small percentage of individuals were involved in studies. And in fact, the first and the largest genomic screen, one of the largest that was published was GWAS study in Alzheimer's by Brian Kunkel et al., had looked at 93,000 individuals of mainly European descent. And we've done similar screens since then, one in African Americans, which only had about 8,000 individuals, and one in Hispanics by Giuseppe Tosto, which had about 4,500 individuals. So you can see there's a real difference in terms of the numbers and availability of participants who have given their DNA to be in these studies. And we know it's a worldwide project. I mean, this is the thing, Alzheimer's is a worldwide project, so we have to really see how we're going to address this. And I just wanted to bring this up because, especially living in Florida, where we have such a diverse population, it's really important to see the growth really is in these non-European populations across much of the United States. And this is, as the growth continues, then we also have to match that with our ability to address these groups when we look at these biological variables. And this is just another way of showing, as we go to 2060, the aging population is going to really dramatically change its look and what we can expect. So we have to address it now. A little bit about, now I wanted to bring up the topics for those of you who aren't familiar with global ancestry versus local ancestry. Global ancestry, you look at you look at the entire population. And if you look at these populations, and here we have the continental populations, European, African, Asian, Amerindian. And you can see, if you look at globally individuals, you can see most Africans are almost all African background, Amerindians, almost all Amerindians, East Asians, Europeans. You can see before these populations came together, it was very little admixture between the groups. As admixture happens when individuals from two or more genetically distinct populations are interbreedings. So now if you look at African Americans, you'll see on the average, you have the African, but also some of the European population. Puerto Ricans are tri-ancestral with Amerindian, European, and excuse me, and African backgrounds. And then if you look at something like the Peruvian population, you're going to see the Peruvians are mostly Amerindian, European, and then some Asian and some African background. And if you look at the populations in the US, if you look at the ancestral, the continental populations, and you see, and these are individuals that we see, we have a high incidence of, especially in Miami. We have Cuban Americans, African Americans, Peruvians, Puerto Ricans, and then there's also Dominicans and Mexican Americans. And you can see the different global admixture percentages. However, I wanted to talk about admixture and local ancestry, because local ancestry is something that we've just started to really understand and to look at. So over time, as two populations come together and interbreed, the chromosomes, after one generation, you have one of each population chromosome in terms of admixture. After several generations, you get more of a pattern. And so if you look at this is someone who's US Black population is a two-way admixed population with genetic ancestry from African and European ancestry. So local ancestry estimates, these are the chromosomes, and this represents one individual, and this is the regions along the chromosomes, which are European in ancestry versus the blue, which is African in ancestry. So we now know that local ancestry is incredibly important when you're trying to look at biological differences. And here's an example of admixture and local ancestry. And these are actual participants in our PRADI study, which is a study of Puerto Ricans in the US and on the island of Puerto Rico in the mainland US. These individuals all identify as Puerto Rican, but you see their percentages of admixture very different from someone who's almost 84% African to 13% European, 30% let me see, I think that's 3%, I can't see the slide, Amerindian, to someone who's mostly Amerindian, very little African and European, and someone who's almost all European, all identifying as part of the study, but very different when we go to look at their genetic material. I mean, I think we were talking about race later, so I'd like to show you something. As we said, ancestry is a biological variable and is about the history of genetic variation and the origin of one's population. Race in itself is not biological, but it's also self-described or socially ascribed. As I've shown, the populations used to live in isolation in each geographic region having its own genetic map. But today it's very different. In the US, you have so many individuals who are admixed. They're a true melting pot, both in terms of individuals ancestry, but also within an individual. So I like to show this slide, and especially I show it sometimes and explain it to our participants, and they find it extremely interesting. All these individuals, they started in a study that Goldie Bird and I studied many years ago when I was at Duke, to look at Black African Americans in terms of their background, and to look at them and get them involved in genetics research. And here we see these individuals all self-identified as African American and all participated in our study. But as you can see, their admixture is very different from somebody who's 99% African, 1% European, to somebody who's 97% European, 93% European, only 77% African. But they all identified their race as African American. So it shows you that we're really trying to get at the biological ancestry, because this, in terms of when we're looking for genetic differences, is what we are looking for. And how do we know this is real? You know, we talked a long time about this before we were able to do some of this. And now we know, and I'm using ApoE as an example, because everybody knows ApoE. We know now, and this is some work done by Dr. Rajabli, where we showed that factors contributing to lower risk in ApoE are due to ancestry-specific genetic factors near ApoE rather than non-genetic, ethnic, cultural, and environmental factors. And this was, there were early studies in African Americans where ApoE had a kind of a varying risk, but often different from Europeans. And also, you looked at some of the early studies of Hugh Henry in the Indiana group. They also showed that there were differences in the African populations with the Abadan study. And this came together now that we could look at local ancestry to show that there was a difference, and the difference was based on the haplotype around the ApoE gene. And we've seen it in other populations. Amerindians, some of the data rising now showing it's a little higher than Europeans, with Africans having the lowest risk. Some other studies we've seen too, and we've seen difference in expression studies with individuals of diverse backgrounds. This is a study from, I should say, from Tony Griswold with our group, looking at individuals of Puerto Rican, African, and European descent to show these ancestral differences. And this is from Giuseppe Tosto's group, looking at Hispanics, where they've also found ancestry-specific disease mechanisms. So we're showing differences that are important that have to be considered when we do our studies. Another gene is ABCA7. It is a risk gene in Europeans, but it has a much more significant effect in African individuals of African American or African ancestry background. It has a much stronger effect in terms of risk. So in essence, why is this important? And again, this is something from a recent paper by Giuseppe looking at Hispanics, that we found that it's prediction. When you go to do prediction with something called a polygenic risk score, which everybody's heard about, you got a much better prediction when you used information from a Hispanic background or GWAS study than using European. And this is going to be important as we get more and more precise estimates in these different groups, that when we want to use it in prediction and combine it with biomarker data, I think somebody before me mentioned that this is important. There are differences there too, that it's critical that we know something about the background and have diversity in our sample. Therefore, we also know that another reason to look at diversity is there are critical variants. Sometimes we like to call them low frequency or rare variants that can be missed. I already mentioned ABCA7 and the difference in risk, but also some novel rare loci that we found in the African American GWAS that were not seen in individuals of European descent. So in general, the summary from the genetic risk factors can be different depending on your ancestral backgrounds. Mechanisms, pathways between ancestries appear to be similar, but some pathways may be more important in some ancestors than others. ABCA7, for example, is a stronger risk factor for AD in African ancestry. ApoE is a much weaker risk factor for AD in African ancestry individuals. This includes individuals are admixed, such as our Puerto Rican population. And the ancestry of your patient, where you inherited your ApoE allele for, could determine your risk, and your risk could be different. Tests for different ancestral risks suggest different therapies may be needed. So I wanted to show how we're taking and using, now that we've increasing our diversity, and using this in some of our studies and how it's having an impact. And there are two, like something called admixture mapping. And there's a recent paper that came again from Giuseppe's lab on Hispanics, and also one that really came from, this is the CADRI project, which is a collaboration of several different groups looking at admixture and being able to look at a novel Alzheimer's disease risk regions in African Americans. And so basically admixture mapping, why do we do it? Well, it has a lower multiple testing burden than SNP-based GWAS studies, where you have to correct for all the SNPs in the genome. And so it can identify genomic regions that might harbor multiple risk loci. Real quick, what you're looking for is a difference between the two populations you're comparing, and this identifies, this could help identify the region. And in fact, in doing this large study, we were able to identify a novel region on chromosome 17 and one on 18. And this is just gives a little more detail about those regions when we map the area that we found because of the admixture mapping, because of the different frequencies between the individuals of African ancestry and European ancestry, but actually occurs on a European background. So it was very interesting. This is something that they're following up. This is a tool that we're going to be using more and more as we increase our data sets. Let me go on here. Another one is to look at the ApoE protective allele. As you know, I mentioned about Dr. Rajabli first reported the difference in the two. And now, so how do we find something protective in the area? Because there's something different on the African haplotype. And this is just a little way this is done in Jeff Vance's lab where he's taken a three-prong approach. The group is taking a three-prong approach, looking at autopsy cases, looking at sequence differences, and looking at IPS differences. And this just shows that in addition to Farid's paper, there's been two other papers that show this difference due to the local ancestry surrounding ApoE. And just recently, there was a paper published in PLOS Genetics that actually identified a SNP, and this is by looking at the sequence data that was different, that looks like it's protective, that actually gives you a huge difference in protection when you look at those that have it and that those that don't with their ApoE4 for 4 genotypes. And excuse me, this was first seen in something, the ADSP 17K. So we're really using the data, the sequence data from that, and then replicated in the data from Ibadan and in our Puerto Rican admixed population. So the data that we're bringing together as part of these studies are now making a difference in new discoveries. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the ADSP and what it does. I'm sure if I didn't talk about it, I think Lisan talked about it and how we're trying to pull together these different groups because we now know the importance of diversity in these sample sets. Excuse me. Here's our target population, which we're trying to target over the next 5 years. We want to try to get at least 20,000 individuals in these different groups. And here's kind of where we are and where we're aiming to go towards in order to get enough power to be able to characterize these variants and to characterize these variants more universally across different sizes. And you could see the new releases of data. The release in 2021, which is 17K, and the one that just came out, the 37K. So as you can see, the population demographics are changing, where we are starting to get more of these different diverse groups into the sample set. And then I wanted to mention a couple of studies that are ongoing. Here's a new study that I'm involved in that brings together not only our partners in the US, but also our partners in Africa, where we'll be ascertaining in the next 5 years, at least 13 individuals, both of Hispanic and mixed individuals, Latino Americans, 4,000 Black Americans, and 5,000 Africans. And we're very excited about this. I also wanted to champion the speaker before me because social determinants of health are critically important. And we're starting off right by collecting these data. And I have the fortunate to be able to work with Azizi Saisis, who just was recruited to University of Miami, as well as Dr. Joshua Akinyemi, who is working with the data and pulling together a questionnaire that's going to be able to deal with all the different groups that are coming into the studies. And we're really excited about that. So we will have that data, and I understand and I champion that if NAC can fill out those forms, it'll be really helpful to everything we're doing going down the line. There were also other foreign cohorts I wanted to mention. The Korean cohort between Jung Ho Lee and Lindsay, the Australian cohort, Paul Lacroix, and the SARS-CoV infection and ancestral genomic variations cohort from Argentina, Gabriel Orozquin and Sudis Esradri, and also the Lazidad study with Jin Cook Lee. All these cohorts are being developed, have been developed, and are being included as part of the sequencing project. I think Lisan, I caught the end of his presentation, and he told you about ACAD, which is very exciting and just starting up. So I won't spend too much time on that. And their strategy, a lot of people involved, a lot of important, a lot of individuals pulling this together. It's something that needs to happen sooner rather than later. This is a new study that we're working on where it's going to be focusing on Amerindian background, where we're working with our local collaborators, Mario Cornejo Olivas and Nilton Custodio. Giuseppe Tosto is leading this, and Eden and I are fortunate to be working with them on this, looking at Amerindians in Peru and Bolivia. So here, when I look at our new map, here's where we were, as I showed you initially. And now here is our new international expansion where the ADSP and collaborators are coming together. And it's a very different landscape than where we started. And I think this is really exciting that we're being able to do this. Let me see. So in conclusion, genetic factors can be different depending on your ancestral background. I think I already saw this. Hang on. I think it's important that we start looking at social determinants of health, and that the ADSP FUS, or the follow-up study, is focused on Asian, African American, Hispanic, Latino ancestry populations. And it's critically important to increase diversity in genomic analysis to truly achieve the ability to conduct cross-ancestry comparisons and clarify differences in genetic etiology and potential molecular therapeutics. I just want to acknowledge everybody that's helped on this, and thank you again for giving me the chance to speak on something of which I am truly passionate.
Thank you, Dr. Parachek-Vance. We have time for one question, if anyone has one. If not, if you want to put your questions into the Hublot Q&A, Dr. Vance, you can answer them via Hublot as we continue. Sure. All right, Sanjay's back for another introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parachek-Vance, for that excellent presentation. Thank you. All right, the next presentation is by Dr. Michelle Milkey. Dr. Milkey is chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Prevention and professor of epidemiology and gerontology and geriatric medicine at the Wake Forest University School of Medicine. As you all know, Dr. Milkey, prior to going to Wake, was at the Mayo Clinic and was there for many years. And her area of expertise is research in translational epidemiology, and she's done some very unique novel blood-based biomarker studies trying to determine and assess their implementation at the population level to screen and diagnose Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. It's a pleasure to invite Dr. Milkey to make a presentation entitled Impact of Race and Ethnicity on Alzheimer's Biomarkers. Dr. Milkey.
Well, thank you so much, Sanjay, and the rest of the executive committee for the opportunity to speak with you today. This is something that has garnered a lot of interest, and so I'm hoping to keep this a little bit shorter so we can have more discussion at the end. These are my disclosures. So I'm going to start out just highlighting some of the studies, and you'll see that there are not a whole lot of studies to date that have started to examine AD biomarkers by race and ethnicity. And then I'll try and put some of this into context, building off of what Dr. Parachek-Vance just reported, as well as Dr. Barnes reported in terms of social determinants of health and some of the factors that we need to consider going forward. So first, in terms of studies examining biomarker differences, let me start by just being a little bit didactic and pedantic. Of course, there are several advantages to applying biomarkers in conjunction with clinical examination across race and ethnicities in the population. As has already been discussed, there are, of course, some difficulties in terms of understanding norms and in the context of different levels and access to education. So biomarkers can help in terms of the clinical diagnosis and underlying pathology. Can also help be a better target individuals for best therapies, trials, or interventions. And of course, with the advance in technologies and availability now of blood-based biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease, blood markers are now more advantageous in leveling the playing field, both for research purposes, but also for clinical purposes. As has been discussed here before, there's certainly lower participation rates for African Americans, Hispanics, other underrepresented groups in terms of doing a lumbar puncture for collection of CSF or even amyloid and tau PET. And clinically, there's also less access for underrepresented minorities for these tests as well. So in terms of starting to look at differences, really when we are thinking of validating biomarkers, autopsy is the gold standard for which we compare the fluid and PET biomarkers to. And so I wanted to start out just highlighting what some of the differences are in the literature to date. Importantly, Wynn and Brittany Duggar and several others recently published a paper highlighting the very limited number of peer-reviewed studies that have looked at racial and ethnic differences in autopsy samples. They actually only identified 10 peer-reviewed papers that had incorporated African Americans, some of these which used the same data set, 6 that incorporated Hispanics, 6 of Japanese American men, all of the Honolulu Asia Aging Study projects, and 0 studies, autopsy studies that have included Native American groups as well as other racial or ethnic groups. Notably, many of the studies in this report did not identify differences in AD pathologies between the different racial and ethnic groups, but many of these studies were limited by sample sizes of racial and ethnic groups, and some of the studies had very limited information in terms of clinical phenotype or other phenotype prior to autopsy. A couple of the larger studies have shown that mixed pathologies do tend to be more common in African Americans as compared to whites. And these mixed pathologies may include vascular pathologies as well as Lewy bodies. In addition, a recent study has also suggested that Hispanics are 2 times as likely to have a higher Braak neurofibrillary tangle stage as compared to non-Hispanic whites. Here's a nice review by a paper that Dr. Barnes just recently published, which is very organized and can easily show you what some of these differences are, highlighting PET and CSF markers for African Americans as compared to whites. And if you look at the top and bottom, there's been amyloid PET comparisons. The top study in ERIC found higher amyloid PET levels in African Americans compared to whites, whereas the bottom study did not find a difference. The 4 studies in the middle all have focused on CSF p-tau and t-tau, finding lower levels among African Americans as compared to whites. Notably, 3 of these studies are in the same cohort. And in all of them, again, the sample sizes are relatively low for African Americans. Similarly, the IDEAS study recently published a paper within the last couple of weeks in JAMA Neurology. And of course, IDEAS is looking at the benefits of adding amyloid PET on patient outcomes. And in this particular analysis, they one-to-one matched individuals based on age, race, sex, history of hypertension, diabetes, family history, as well as clinical diagnosis. And what you can see here, first, comparing Asians and whites, Asians had a lower probability of being amyloid PET positive. In addition, on the far right, Hispanics also had a lower probability of being amyloid PET positive. There was a lower probability for blacks as compared to whites. However, this was not statistically significant in this sample. In further research, because the IDEAS study is over 17,000 individuals, when they looked at the larger sample size, they did find that all racial and ethnic groups had lower levels of amyloid PET as compared to white comparison group. In addition, this is a nice paper from WashU and Suzanne Schindler, also further highlighting differences in CSF and plasma markers in African Americans and whites. And what they found was that CSF amyloid beta 42 to 40 ratio was higher, and CSF p-tau and total tau levels were lower in African Americans compared to whites. Interestingly, when they also looked at plasma markers, plasma amyloid beta 42-40 ratio was also higher, but there were no differences in terms of p-tau 181 or NFL. And these markers are symbolic and representative of their finding as well, that there was lower amyloid PET levels in African Americans compared to whites, hence the higher levels of amyloid beta 42-40 ratio in the CSF as well as in blood. In further work, they looked to see whether there were differences by race and ethnicity in determining the probability of whether somebody was amyloid positive, either based on CSF or amyloid PET. And they did find individually, looking at p-tau 181, 231, and NFL, that African Americans had a lower probability to be amyloid positive given a specific level of the biomarker. However, then when they combined all of these biomarkers together in one model, they did not find that race was a predictor. This study by Hare has also been recently published looking at CSF and plasma in African Americans and whites. And here again, we find in both plasma and CSF that African Americans had a lower level of Alzheimer's disease pathology, whether based on higher levels of plasma or CSF, amyloid beta 42 to 40 ratio, or lower levels of CSF p-tau 181 or plasma 181. Now, most of the studies that I've shown you to date have compared African Americans and whites. Sid O'Brien and a couple other studies have also compared Hispanic populations or Mexican Americans to non-Hispanic whites as well. And similarly to some of the past studies with African Americans, we further see that Mexican Americans tend to have lower levels of amyloid beta 40, as well as total tau and NFL. Notably, in a subset looking at amyloid PET positivity in the Oblate study as well, there was a lower percent of amyloid PET positivity among those individuals that were cognitively unimpaired, MCI and AD, for those with Mexican American origins as compared to non-Hispanic whites. And then similarly, looking at the white cap population and comparing for postmortem diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease by race and ethnicity, there were no significant differences in terms of actual levels of the plasma markers. However, p-tau was numerically better in terms of predicting AD diagnosis for Black and Hispanic populations as compared to whites. Interestingly, NFL was the reverse, and so it was notably better for white populations as compared to the African American or Hispanic. So as I mentioned to start with, there really are not that many studies that have focused on racial and ethnic differences. But I think it is important to start thinking about what some of the reasons for these differences are. And as Dr. Marasek-Vance had already talked about, there are differences, of course, in ApoE effects, which certainly can affect the pathology and levels of the biomarkers. It's already been discussed that the ApoE4 allele is less penetrant in African Americans and may also be weaker among Latinos as compared to non-Latino whites. Similarly, in American Indian cohort, the Strong Heart study, the E4 allele was less penetrant, was less associated with hippocampal volume and memory and other cognitive tests as well. Focusing and again building on ancestry is a nice study highlighting again that even among Latinos, ancestry is incredibly important, such that those Latinos that had an American Indian origin had a lower odds of significant cognitive decline when they had an ApoE4 allele. And more recently, this has also been looked at in the A4 study, where individuals, although the relative or overall number of African Americans in the A4 study were low, those that did have an E4 allele had less odds of being amyloid positive. And when they looked further, a greater increase or percent of African ancestry was associated with a lower probability of being amyloid PET positive. And so, in terms of ApoE genotype, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up in the biomarker context is that there are some algorithms that are being developed for diagnosis or prognosis that include both the blood or CSF biomarkers as well as ApoE combined. And as you can see, there are some difficulties and problems when we incorporate ApoE because it's not going to work as well across the entire population. And so that's something that we are going to have to consider going forward, particularly in expanding this to the clinic. Of course, many of you have already seen me present this data, but again, I want to highlight that there are different factors that are associated with these markers that may contribute to racial and ethnic differences. And as we've previously shown, and other studies have shown, for example, obesity leads to a larger blood volume, and that can lead to lower levels of these markers. So in this case, obesity may lead to lower levels of p-tau, and the frequency of obesity is higher in African Americans and Hispanics and some other underrepresented minorities. In contrast, we've shown that chronic kidney disease can enhance and elevate the levels of these markers. Chronic kidney disease is more prevalent also in underrepresented minorities, African Americans and Hispanics. And so interestingly, in the case of chronic kidney disease, levels would be elevated, although some of the studies are suggesting that African Americans have lower levels. So if we take chronic kidney disease into account, there may even be a wider spread than what we're actually seeing. So in terms of understanding and comparing these biomarkers by racial ethnic groups, it's really important to consider the differences in the frequencies of these confounding factors as well. And then lastly, and as was mentioned by Dr. Barnes, it's really important to understand some of these other mediators and social determinants of health. And I really like how Meeker and colleagues had outline this in terms of examining the direct effects as well as indirect effects or mediators on the measured outcomes or biomarkers. And for example, some of the mediators may be area deprivation index, education, a variety of other social determinants of health as well. Now, there's only been 2 studies to my knowledge, and I apologize if I've missed any, but both which have been recently published and have started to look at this. So in the B-sharp data, which is a slide I presented earlier comparing African Americans and whites, both CSF and plasma biomarker levels, they did run some structural equation models where they looked at, and I'm sorry, these letters are a little bit small, but as mediators, they looked at C-reactive protein, systolic blood pressure, BMI, area deprivation index, and ApoE. And in this particular study, they really didn't find an effective mediation. However, another study by Meeker did find that area deprivation index did mediate racial differences in MRI measures of Alzheimer's disease. So again, only 2 studies out to date, but this is certainly an area that much more work is needed to understand the overall effects of some of these social determinants of health and other mediators. The other aspect is that going forward, it's also very important to consider the timing of the assessment of the mediators. So if we're looking in late life and trying to understand the impact of some of the mediators that I just measured, you're really looking at those that have survived to older ages. And some of these mediators may contribute to earlier onset of dementia and cognitive decline, particularly among American Hispanics as well as African Americans. And so they may not, looking at some of these older populations, we may not see some of those differences. So just in conclusion, there are some studies that suggest that Alzheimer's disease fluid and imaging biomarkers levels differ by race and ethnicity. However, there are many studies that also do not. As I've already highlighted, many of the studies to date have been limited by sample size, and they've also been limited by study design. So of course, there are some studies that exclude those individuals that have a lot of cardiovascular disease, and since that may be more prevalent among African Americans or some other underrepresented groups, you're not getting a true population phenotype. And as was mentioned earlier as well, I think it's critically important. As you can see, most of the studies that have been done to date tend to compare African Americans, whites, Hispanics, and whites. And it's really important to move beyond that to start looking within groups as well and thinking of some of the underlying effects of that. And of course, factors can be similar associated with AD pathology and biomarkers across groups, but some groups may be overburdened, and so that difference in prevalence will need to be considered. Again, to highlight that most studies, including racial and ethnic groups, are not represented. So of course, the CSF studies and autopsy studies, for those that do include underrepresented groups, tend to have much higher education and higher income level. And so it's really critical that we get further in the community and enroll a broader population. And then lastly, as I mentioned in my last couple slides, there's really a limited examination of social determinants of health and other factors resulting in racialization and their effect on the biomarkers as well. So if there's any junior individuals in the audience, this is a great thesis project or a K grant or something in terms of going forward that is really important at this point. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you. We have time for one in-person question and one virtual.
Hi, Michelle, sorry. Charlie to Carly, yet again. One of the things we published recently on the plasma biomarkers, we were noticing that we tend to use the 40 to 42 ratio a lot, 42 to 40 ratio. We're seeing differences in the 40 as well. And so it's an interesting phenomenon. It may be the plasma effect. We don't have CSF, match CSF. So it would be really interesting to dig into this a little bit more to see what's going on, because I think there are many factors that are influencing these group differences that are being published.
I agree with that, and I think in Sid O'Brien's work in the Oblate study too, they had found the same thing. I think it was A beta 40 that showed the biggest difference.
Yeah, I think it goes up, I believe.
Right. Yeah. So again, another reason for more research.
And Dr. Milkey, we have a virtual question from Dr. Boris DeCourt. He asks, since diverse individuals have different levels of amyloid and tau compared to Caucasians, and because we want to include more individuals from diverse backgrounds, does it make sense to continue with the ATN framework for AD research moving forward?
Trick question here, right? No, I think the ATN framework was really to try and understand the biology with a focus on recruiting those individuals that would be most helped by some of the clinical trials. So if you're looking at an amyloid therapy or a tau therapy, one thing is you want to make sure that you're including those individuals that have those pathologies, or it's not going to work. So no, I don't think the ATN theory needs to go away. But I do think we need to examine these pathologies and combinations of pathologies across more diverse samples and understand what their impact is. And it is likely, especially with these co-pathologies, that you may have a lesser level of amyloid and tau in your brain, but because they have more cerebrovascular disease, then you're seeing more cognitive impairment. Whereas if you took that away, then maybe as they got older, they would have the underrepresented minorities would also have more or higher levels of amyloid and tau as well. So I guess in closing, no, I don't think we should do away with the ATN criteria. I think it needs to be put in context and used where its biggest strengths are. But we do need to understand the general prevalence of amyloid and tau pathology and cerebrovascular pathology across populations and the factors that contribute to those pathologies.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milkey. That was such an informative presentation. Thank you. Our next and the last scientific presentation is by Dr. Monica Rivera Min. She is president of the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society. She's a professor of psychology at Fordham University and has a joint appointment in the Department of Neurology at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Her research focus is on intersection of cultural neuroscience, neuropsychology, and health disparities, and she's doing this research, which is all NIA and Alzheimer's Association-funded research utilizing a community-based model. So Dr. Rivera Min, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good? Okay, I'm going to assume that everything is fine. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm very happy to be joining you remotely. Here are my acknowledgements and disclosures. As you see here, I have no conflicts of interest that I am aware of. And I bolded the leadership advisory experience with the CDC Bold Public Health Center of Excellence on Dementia Risk Reduction expert panel, because that experience, it's really, you know, such a tremendous gift when you have an experience when the work that you do together becomes really an enriching, truly enriching part of your own work. And it's been such a pleasure. So some of the work that I've done with that group, I'll be sharing here today as well. Before we begin, I want to highlight that I live, work, and conduct my research and have sent my kids to school, public schools here in Harlem, USA, where I'm joining you from. And we have worked with the New York Indian Council to develop this land acknowledgement to acknowledge our positionality in the work that we do. We acknowledge the people of the tribal nations and tribes in New York City, including the Lanai, Lenape, Cayuga, and others, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. And we recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that the United States consumes. We pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to share my personal positionality statement. Positionality essentially reflects a scientist's worldview and the position they adopt about a research task and its social and political context. This positionality impacts ontological and epistemological assumptions. And I think that it's really important as scientists, as we move forward, that we all consider our positionality and publicly share it would be great, so that we can really understand the lens from which we're seeing our work and how that can influence and really enrich our work. So I have two axes here to share with you. In terms of my axis of diversity, I'm an Afro-Latinx Indigenous daughter of immigrants from the Caribbean and South America. I meet NIH's criteria for disadvantaged background on 6 of 7 of their benchmarks. In terms of my own health journey, growing up, I either did not have health insurance or was inadequately insured. And in terms of my education, English is not my first language, Spanish is, and I was in ESL until the 3rd grade and did not enjoy the same quality of education as many of my peers, probably many of you here today. And in terms of my occupational experiences, I started working when I was 13 years old. My first 2 jobs were picking strawberries and selling carnations on the side of the freeway outside of the Punney Hills Mall in California. In terms of my axis of privilege, I'm a cisgender hetero woman, And I take that, and understand that that is a privilege in this society. I'm US born, which is like winning the lottery compared to folks from other countries. I'm able-bodied, I'm educated, and I have had the privilege to have excellent training in both neuropsychology, which is my focused area of training, but also in community-based participatory research training, which is formal training from Mount Sinai, where I conduct my research. I'm also currently in middle class, and I have had the great good fortune to have a tremendous circle of support. My sister circle and my hermanas have really helped, and hermanos have helped me through so much to be able to be here in front of you today, to be sharing our work together. And finally, I would note that another axis of privilege is that for whatever reason, I seem to have the temperament to withstand the sociocultural challenges and assaults of, that academia can sometimes confer to those of us who come from minoritized backgrounds. And I love the work, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. And today I'll be talking about giving you a little bit of context, much of which you've heard a bit about, so I will go through that quickly. I'll talk a little bit also with you about my framework, about how I think about research, and again, how that informs our work, and how I think it informs the issues here about ethnocultural factors as it relates to clinical Alzheimer's phenotypes. And we'll talk about those factors, and finally talk about how we move forward. So as has already been noted, the United States is rapidly diversifying. Between 2010 and 2050, we will see almost doubling of the Latinx population. We'll also see an almost doubling of the Asian diaspora, and significant growth in the American Indian indigenous population as well. Not only that, but our society is also increasingly linguistically diverse. I see that there is something goofy happening with my slides. Hold on one second. Things are coming up at the same time. Sorry. Anyway, we'll just go with it. Our population is also aging at differential rates. And so research suggests that, for instance, the Latinx population, the percentage of the population that's 65 and older, is growing. That segment of the population is growing at 3.5 times the rate of the non-Latinx white population. We're also quite linguistically diverse. And in terms of brain health equities, as you've heard before, Black and Latinx older adults appear to be anywhere from 1.5 to 3, as much as 3 times as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than non-Latinx whites. In addition, they appear to, some studies suggest that they demonstrate a younger age of onset and greater severity of initial symptoms. Let's see. In terms of a context of disadvantage, beyond just issues around prevalence, research also suggests that in individuals who are 65 and older, about Black and Latinx adults are about 30 to 40% less likely to access outpatient neurology care compared to non-Latinx white. And not surprisingly, they're more likely to receive care in ER, have longer hospital stays, and higher inpatient costs after a neurologic diagnosis. And I note here that this research is primarily based on individuals who are 65 years old and above, because both in terms of prevalence and incidence, as well as in terms of these different types of inequities in actual care, we know very little about diverse populations under the age of 65. And I also will note a significant limitation of the work that I'm sharing with you. It's mostly centered on Black and Latinx adults, because those are the minoritized populations for which we have the most data at the time. And I know that's changing, and I'm really excited about that. In terms of a framework and a way of thinking about these issues, I was going to say I'm going to argue to you, but I don't want to argue. But what I would say is that in my own work, I published on this kind of expanded way of thinking about issues that could be impacting brain health dementia and the like. And that framework, I've expanded the biopsychosocial model to include the cultural level of analysis. This was a model I started writing about back in 2008. And since then, I've also been thinking a lot about structural and systemic factors as well. So I'm going to take you through just a few slides that will highlight some of the work in the field and some of our group's work that demonstrate ways that we can think about measuring and looking at and understanding clinical AD phenotyping. So with regard to the biological level of analysis, you've already heard in the last great talk a lot about genetic factors. And as it's been discussed, ApoE4 does not confer the similar level of risk in certainly in Caribbean and Mexican populations as it does with European American populations. However, presenilin 1 and 2 do seem to be more robust across populations in terms of their predictive ability. In terms of cognition, and I'm just going to be kind of hitting a couple of highlights in these different spheres of influence, then I'll talk more about the sociocultural level of analysis as we think about phenotyping. With regard to cognition, we know that individuals from minoritized backgrounds are more likely to be misclassified in terms of their cognitive functioning. So even though cognitive tests are critical for clinical AD phenotyping, we also know that these tests were created from a Western perspective, mostly and historically normed on middle class, upper middle class, highly educated, as was noted, mostly European American or non-Latinx white populations. And so the result of that is that these cognitive tests can yield very high or higher false positive rates than would actually be the case if we had more culturally tailored and appropriate instrumentation. And so this, these, as you see here, what I'm showing you on this slide is the level of percent misclassification if we only use age-corrected normative data, and then on the right side, if we use age, education, and gender-corrected information. And you see that while the misclassification rates remain quite low for the European American non-Latinx white group, they're unacceptably high, certainly for the Black African American sample, and higher in the Latinx population or sample here as well. For that reason, it is absolutely imperative that we think carefully about our cognitive instrumentation. And I'm going to circle back to this later since I'm a neuropsychologist. I think about this a lot, but I also want to note that while norms have historically really been held up as a panacea to address a lot of these issues and mismatch with the people who we are evaluating and the instrumentation or the toolbox that we have. Certainly having precision normative data is necessary if we want to have better clinical phenotyping of these minoritized populations, but it's really not sufficient. So some of the key issues that we need to think about as we consider the norms that we're using in our clinical phenotyping of our participants include issues around the time and history when the norms were created. Oftentimes we use norms that are 20, 25 years old, if not older. And really the shelf life of norms is closer to about 10 to 15 years. Whether or not there's an adequate normative sample size, and many times these cell sizes are quite small, unacceptably small, when you get into significant demographic adjustments for multiple demographic factors. And also I want to note this great point from this paper from Dr. Adam Brickman and colleagues from 2006, that it's imperative that normative data are appropriately stratified in the ways to best capture demographic factors that we know contribute to test performance. And here in the slide, I'm highlighting, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm highlighting some recent work that we published through the neuropsychological norms for the U.S.-Mexico border region in Spanish. And in this series of papers, we observed and reported that utilizing appropriate Spanish language measures, not surprisingly, and using these demographic adjustments significantly improved the classification rates. One thing that we also reported in these papers that I wasn't going to get too much into when I get to sociocultural factors is we also reported that being bilingual also is a significant contributor to test performance. And we don't have norms, as far as I know. I hope I'm wrong, but as far as I know, we don't have norms that include bilingualism as a predictor, but we know that that's a significant factor as well to consider as we think about the strengths and limitations of our normative data. And over here on the left, I highlight a paper that I recently published with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Desiree Bird, that really gets more into the nitty gritty of the recent concerns around demographic adjustments in normative data and, and the role of race. And so I encourage you to take a look at that. But basically the punchline is that while there are significant problems with our normative data at the time, norms are not the only problem that we have in the cognitive phenotyping of our minoritized populations, and we need to take a much broader perspective on thinking about sociocultural factors as well. With regard to emotion, I'm also mindful of time. With regard to emotional functioning, depression and depressive symptoms are typically the most common area of phenotyping that we conduct. And I bring up this wonderful paper that one of my former students, Emily Morris, she's conducted with us. She's now at University of Michigan and doing great, I'm happy to report. But basically, when we do our phenotyping on emotional factors like depressive symptomology, we usually just look at total scores or maybe a cutoff, an overall score, and use that across the different populations for whom we are trying to characterize. But as we note in this study here, it turns out that if we're doing that, at least with Latinx participants in this study, then we might really be missing a lot of important information, because it turns out that there are different clinical manifestations or expressions of symptomology. And in the Latinx culture, there might be a higher risk for a somatization, not just the Latinx culture, but others who are more traditionally identified with that culture. And so here in this bottom left side box, you see the Beck Depression Inventory, how we split out symptoms to cognitive affective symptoms versus somatic and functional symptoms. And this is a validated approach that Beck published on many years ago. And we looked to see if we differentiated these types of symptom presentations, if these different variables would differentially predict cognition in Latinx and non-Latinx white individuals. And sure enough, what we found was there was this differential impact of depressive symptomology, such that in the Latinx group, which you see here, we had 100 Latinx middle-aged and older adults, we found that if you look to BDI-NFS, so it's the third column, this is for the somatic symptoms. And we found that that this more somatic manifestation of depression significantly predicted performance in terms of global neurocognitive functioning. These are average T-scores that we were predicting, processing speed, and also we observed a trend level association with regard to verbal fluency. So again, if we're just doing broad strokes in terms of our characterization of emotional symptomology, we are probably missing the boat in many ways, but this is just an exemplar. With regard to sociocultural factors, so I'm going to skip over to this. There are a couple of pieces of work that I'd like to highlight to you as we think about, as we move forward with, it's great that we are, that the field is more centered on equity and justice and inclusion. this is wonderful, but we really need to be thinking about deeply phenotyping these minoritized populations in terms of sociocultural characteristics as well, and not just minoritized populations. I would argue all populations, because we have many different dimensions of diversity that can impact risk for cognitive impairment, dementia, and so on. And so this first slide that I'm showing you is from a study that my dear friend and collaborator, Dr. Maria Marquine, and I and others published back in 2018. And I'm going to direct you to look at the top box on the left first. And this is where we're doing kind of what's usually, on the menu for most studies, these between group comparisons with ethnocultural differences. And again, we have to be very careful when we conduct these types of studies, because on one hand, they can be very helpful to document inequities, but on the other hand, they can also serve to be misinterpreted and reify race as a biological construct, which it is not. It is a sociocultural construct. So we have to be very careful when we conduct and present these kinds of analyses. But we did this first to demonstrate that, yes, if you look at the y-axis, we're looking at percent cognitive impairment across a number, excuse me, of different, for global cognitive functioning, a number of domains. And what we found was, not surprisingly, was that the Latinx group did significantly worse on a number of different domains: global functioning, as well as executive functioning, and several others: learning, recall, which is a proxy for memory, and attention working memory. However, if you look at the bottom right box, we then proceeded to do a within group analysis to look at within group heterogeneity. And we compared participants of Mexican American, Chicanx nativity and heritage to our Puerto Rican, primarily Puerto Rican Caribbean participants. And what we found in this case was actually that the Mexican American participants, their rates of cognitive impairment actually looked very similar to the non-Latinx white participants in this study. And these rates are high, I should also note, because this was a study done in individuals with HIV. Apologies for not mentioning that earlier. But so regardless, we see very similar rates of impairment at that point, even though our normative data are not ideal. However, when we look at the black bars to the Puerto Rican group, you see significantly higher rates of cognitive impairment in this Puerto Rican sample compared to the Mexican American sample, particularly as it pertains to global cognition, which was really driven by learning and memory. And so how do we understand or explain this? Well, it turns out that there are a number of health inequity metrics for which, when we look within group at different Latinx subpopulations here in the United States, on a number of metrics like infant mortality and other aspects of mortality and other things, Puerto Ricans tend to do significantly worse and have worse health outcomes compared to Cuban Americans, to Mexicans, and others. They tend to have worse indices. And so this has been an area that my group and I have been continuing to follow up and try to understand further. But I share this with you again to say that we need to be thinking about within group heterogeneity to really understand what's going on with these populations. Next, I encourage you to think about acculturation as we consider clinical Alzheimer's disease phenotyping, because extensive research from our lab, Jen Manley's lab, and the wonderful Dr. Lamar's lab over at Rush demonstrate that acculturation is an important factor for us to be considering, that has a significant impact on a number of outcomes that are certainly important to us as Alzheimer's disease investigators. So I share that with you here. And also one other thing I'm just going to say is that I feel concerned that when we talk about social determinants of health and the like health equities, oftentimes actual cultural variables aren't really discussed as much. And I really appreciate the study because she and her team did such a nice job of really looking at a number of metrics of acculturation. And in our studies, we've used a measure called the AMAS by Zia and colleagues, which we've also really found to be very useful in characterizing acculturation and its association with cognitive functioning. And, kind of the overall story here is that greater US acculturation does appear to be associated with better cognitive test performance and better indices overall. There's some other kind of mixed findings, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. Next, I encourage us to think about socioeconomic status, which Dr. Barnes has already discussed. I highlight a study here where we found that once we accounted, the study was back in 2015, I guess, we found that once we accounted for socioeconomic status, it completely mediated the association between ethnocultural status with learning and ethnocultural status with memory. So the impact of socioeconomic status on cognition is significant. As we move to wrap up, I wanted to highlight some work that collaborators and myself have done with regard to discrimination. So you do get to see a couple of pretty brain slides. So here, this is a study led by a wonderful collaborator, Dr. Urena Clark, here at Mount Sinai. And what she found was that greater experience of discrimination was associated with greater amygdalar activation in the salient network and across several brain regions in the salient network. And this was also after controlling for a number of other potential confounds. And basically this is to say, while some research has shown associations between discrimination and cognition, which I'm going to show you in a second, some work that our group has done, and others have very cogently and nicely shared as well. These issues can also impact us at the neural level as well. And this is another study that this study was led by Dr. April Thames, who's now at UCLA, back in 2013, where we found a significant association between perceived discrimination and as well as stereotype threat, for those of you who are familiar with that. That term, or kind of negative expectations about one's performance, such that individuals who had that sense of greater or experience of greater discrimination, did significantly worse on their test performance. It was associated with worse test performance. And then last, my cat's coming to visit, sorry. Last, I want to just briefly touch on structural and systemic issues that can be impacting the way that we think about clinical phenotyping of minoritized populations, because we certainly do need to put that on the menu as well of things that we want to be considering. And one thing that I want to highlight is the kind of the inherent structural racism in the assessment measures that we use. So Dr. Desiree Bird and I served as co-authors on this commentary where we looked at the Boston naming test, which is one of the most, common tests of, verbal anomia. And we, so it's a very common naming test. And item number 48 is a noose. And this test went through many, iterations. It has been around for decades. It's been included in thousands of articles. And I have used the test as well. My colleagues here who wrote this commentary have also used this test, and we, and I think we believed it reflects kind of the structural racism in our field that it was allowed to kind of continue, even though it was really triggering and traumatizing for individuals, particularly of Black African-American descent, to be subjected to that. So how do we move forward as we consider these issues and brain health equity? So here, you've already heard some about brain health equity, but that is certainly the goal as we move forward with clinical Alzheimer's phenotyping for minoritized populations. I list here a number of different potential targets at the biological psychological and sociocultural and structural levels of analysis that we could consider as potential risk factors for increased risk for cognitive impairment and dementia based on the work that's done. But there's a lot to be done, especially for people under 65 years of age. And also thinking about resilience factors that we might consider as we move forward to try to understand, mitigate dementia risk mitigation as well. And I have those all listed out here as well. So with that, let's wrap up with gaps and key next steps. So in terms of gaps in the literature, as I intimated earlier, I think that we can do a much better job in terms of really deeply phenotyping minoritized populations by more systematically increasing sociocultural measures into our phenotyping. So things like acculturation, paying attention to within group variance, also culturally mediated health beliefs and attitudes that can be having a significant impact on outcomes. Also, I didn't talk much about this, but the issue of intersectionality. So we all exist within multiple dimensions of diversity, no matter what you look like. We all have culture, we all have socioeconomic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and the like. And those intersectionalities are points that we could really, I think, gain a lot of information to help us more in a more nuanced way, characterize our participants and the populations that we wish to understand and serve, and certainly taking a deeper dive into understanding issues around discrimination and persecution at both the individual or contextual level. In terms of key next steps, I think that it's imperative that we flip our contextual lens from a deficit model to more one of empowerment and resilience for brain health. That the way forward is certainly an evidence-based approach, which would include authentic community engagement and inclusion in Alzheimer's research to ethically include diverse populations in our studies. And I urge us all to move beyond pan-ethnic terms and focusing on pan-ethnic terms for mechanisms of resilience and change, and really thinking and being centered on public health issues. And with that, I want to say thank you to all my collaborators, funders, participants, and community partners. I have references for you if you would like them, and I want to say thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we are going to be closing now with Dr. Carter and Dr. Asana.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. We are sorry we just went over a few minutes. I want to thank you all, of course, those who are here in person and calling in virtually. We got a small treat for you all, if you could bear with me for another 2 minutes. I invited Dr. Fubu Carter to recite a poem that she's written for this meeting. Dr. Carter is a Madison Poet Laureate, and she works with the Wisconsin ADRC. And she received a PhD in Women's Studies from University of Nairobi, and she's an award-winning poet in 7 books. Dr. Carter.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Stana for inviting me to do a closing poem. And as you all heard, I am a senior program manager with the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, but as well, I work with some very hardworking colleagues from Madison and Oneida in the outreach program, and we do this under the lab of Dr. Carrie Gleason. So I also am the Wisconsin director of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Project that uses poetry as a way to stimulate memory in working with seniors. So this is my poem that was written. For beloved elders with memory loss. Some call you seniors, I call you wise elders, living long and learning much. You should be honored, your gray hair a symbol of victory and authority in life. When your memory hides or flees and every face seems strange, feel the other signs of love. gentle touch, kind voice, the spirit that welcomes you just as you are. Reassure yourselves that you know how love feels, for this will chase the fear of forgetting away. Thank you.